สองหนึ่งโป๊ะลงโอ้ยโอ้ยโอ้ยโอ้ใครเซลบ้างครับยินดีด้วยอ้าวเฮ้ยไม่รู้ปิดแล้วเอ้ยยังไงแน่ครับยังไงแน่เดี๋ยวขอดูข่าวก่อนคุณไอ้ส
วัสดีครับก็เดี๋ยววันที่3 มีนานะครับตั้งแต่บ่าย2 โมงจนถึงประมาณ3 ทุ่มนะครับเราจะไปพบกันที่จังหวัดอุบลนะครับก็ในงานก็จะมีเทรดสดชนข่าวนะครั้งนี้จะเป็นการเทรดสดชนข่าวนะครับเหมือนเรายกรายการแม่แซงทางโค้งไปไว้ที่อุบลเลยนะครับ
แน่นอนครับเทรดสดชนข่าววันที่3คือเทรดสดนอนฟาร์มถูกไหม
ใช่แล้วชนข่าวนอนฟาร์มกันนะครับ
สำคัญมากเพราะว่านอนฟาร์มเนี่ยเป็นอะไรที่มีความสำคัญอย่างหนึ่งของการเทรดเลยทีเดียวครับคุณนายครับ
นะฮะมันก็จะเป็นปัจจัยในส่วนที่มุมมองของเฟดว่าจะไปในทางทิศทางไหนแล้วก็จะเป็นอีกปัจจัยหนึ่งที่ส่งผลถึงทองคำนะครับว่าจะขึ้นหรือจะลงนะฮะ
แล้วฝั่งเทคนิคก็จะมีมุมมองว่าเฮ้ยจะเป็นยังไงแบบไหน
ใช่ก็จะมีเทคนิคในการเข้าเทรดครับ
สวัสดีครับขอต้อนรับเข้าสู่รายการนายแถลงของครับประจำวันที่8ครับมีนาคม2023ครับเมื่อกี้มีการประกาศตัวเลขนะครับเล็กน้อยนะครับก็เป็นการประกาศเดี๋ยวนะผมขอแวบก่อนที่ไปดูลุงนะครับเป็นการประกาศตัวเลขเดี๋ยวผมขอแวบตัดเลยนะเป็นการประกาศตัวเลขตำแหน่งงานว่างเปิดใหม่ครับจาก JOLTS นะครับก็ประกาศออกมาน้อยกว่าครั้งก่อนนะครับแต่ว่ามากกว่าการคาดการณ์นะครับก็ทำให้ราคาทองคำมีการย่อตัวลงบ้างครับดอลลาร์แข็งค่าขึ้นบ้างการประกาศนี้นะครับเดี๋ยวอีกไม่กี่นาทีก็จะมีฝั่งของคุณลุงเจพาวนะครับนี่เพราะว่าอันนี้น่าจะดีเลย์เดี๋ยวผมขออนุญาตหาก่อนนะครับผมขออนุญาตหาที่มันไม่ดีเลย์ก่อนแล้วกันนะมาหรือยังเดี๋ยวมาหรือยังนะครับเพราะว่าฝั่งนี้ดีเลยครับฝั่งนี้ดีเลยครับขออนุญาตดูก่อนนะครับนะมาแล้วนะครับอ๋ออันนี้เป็นของนะเดี๋ยวขอดูเจ้าอื่นก่อนนะครับเดี๋ยวนะครับเข้ามาแล้วอย่าลืมแชร์นะครับถ้าใครจะแปลไปด้วยกันวันนี้ก็อย่างที่บอกครับหนักหนาสาหัสกันเลยทีเดียวนะผมขอดู Federal Reserve Semi Announce ยังเหมือนกันนะครับโอเคยังเหมือนกันเจ้านี้มาแล้วนะครับคุณลุงโจโรพาเวลเจ้านี้ WGN มาแล้วนะครับเจพาวทยอยมากันแล้วนะครับผมขอดูฟ็อกมีไหมถ้าฟ็อกมีผมก็จะเปิดฟ็อกนะครับมาแล้วครับผมขออนุญาตตัดภาพจากผมไปก่อนนะครับใครที่พร้อมพิมพ์พอพานแล้วกันเพราะฟ็อกมาด้วยก็คือในฝั่งของคุณโจโรมพาเวลจะมาให้การต่อหน้าคณะบริการทางด้านการเงินนะครับที่สภาคองเกรสนี่ของผมใช้คำว่าของอะไรวะของเดี๋ยวนะอันนี้ผมตัดทิ้งเลยถ้าจำไม่ผิดน่าจะเป็นของตัวท็อปคุณมิสเตอร์ไมค์เฮนรี่ป่ะนี่มิกหรือไมค์นะครับแชร์แมนของฝั่งของคณะกรรมาธิการทางด้านบริการทางด้านการเงินนะครับก็เข้ามาเรียบร้อยแล้วพร้อมกันหรือยังครับพร้อมมีมอพานนะครับวันนี้ออกแนวสนุกสนานสำราญให้หรือเปล่านะครับออกแนวไหนอย่างไรเตรียมดูกันได้ขอความกรุณานะครับขอเสียงให้ชัดอย่างเดียวพอเสียงไม่ชัดนี่เหนื่อยหน่อย คณะกรรมาการบริการทางด้านการเงินของธนาคารกลางของไม่ใช่ของธนาคารของอะไรนะของสภาผู้แทนราษฎรกลัวเสียงมันจะไม่อันนี้ป่ะสวัสดีทุกท่านสวัสดีครับอย่าลืม1 แชร์ด้วยนะ1 แชร์ด้วยนะครับ1 แชร์1 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 แชร์เมื่อวานวันนี้คุณลุงจะตอบขาขึ้นหรือขาลงแต่เมื่อวานนี่ซัดเต็มเหนียวเดียวเต็มข้อล่อเต็มแข้งเลยนะครับวันนี้เพจไหนไม่แปลเราแปลนะครับเพจไหนไม่แปลเราแปลนะครับเข้าชมต้องปิดมือถือนะครับกลัวเทรดไม่ได้ใจเย็นลูกใจเย็นเพจไหนไม่แปลเราแปลนะครับโอ้โหเสียงยังไม่มาเลยฟอกเสียงมาหน่อยลูกโอเคเสียงไม่เป็นไรนะเสียงเบาๆอะไรอันนี้เร็วกว่า
Thank you, Chairman Powell. I now recommend testimony for 4 minutes today. This week, you stated that the Fed will, quote, stay the course until the job is done. And that is to restore price stability. This is positive. But you know as well as I do, you're facing a very strong headwind from the political left. Democrats are pressuring the Fed to stray from its narrow mandate. It's a page out of their same old progressive playbook. When they don't have the votes to achieve something here in Congress, they turn to regulators. And now, Chair Powell, they're looking at you in the Federal Reserve. President Biden's kowtowing to the far left got us into this inflationary mess. I urge you to reject the ideologues who put their social agenda ahead of economic prosperity. High prices continue to eat away at workers' wages and retirees' incomes. Since President Biden took office, we've experienced inflation at rates not seen since the late 70s and early 80s. Inflation rapidly accelerated after Democrats passed their so-called American Rescue Plan, which poured nearly $2 trillion of inflationary fuel into the economy. By June of last year, the Consumer Price Index showed inflation skyrocketed from below 2% to nearly 9%. And personal consumption expenditures, the Fed's preferred measure of consumer prices, ballooned to 7%. Instead of being rescued by Democrats, Americans were punished with pain at the grocery store and sticker shock at the pump. While inflation is now below its mid-2022 peak,
สวัสดีทั้งหมดนะครับ
persisting at rates well above the Fed's target.
2,200 นะครับ
remains broad-based and
ยังไง
continues
1 แช
to
ร์ด้วย
hammer Americans' pocketbooks. In fact, a recent Gallup poll shows half of the respondents say they are worse off financially than a year ago. It's clear that there's still a long way to go in the effort to bring down costs. I look forward to hearing you reaffirm your commitment to that work today. Republicans also want to hear from you regarding some concerning developments at the Federal Reserve on the regulatory front. Recently, the Federal Reserve's Vice Chair for Supervision announced a quote-unquote holistic review of bank capital in the Fed's regulatory regime. However, it seems that only a small group within the Fed knows what this means, what it entails, how much review is being vetted by the full board, and the type of quantitative analysis the Fed is performing. The Fed shouldn't operate in the shadows, especially when the regulation in question can have broad and significant economic effects. It's also unclear the motivation for the Fed.
สวัสดีทุกท่านนะครับสวัสดีครับสวัสดีอีกครั้งนะครับอย่าลืม1 แชร์นะครับตอนนี้เป็นการแถลงของคุณลุงเจอโรม พาเวลต่อหน้าคณะกรรมการบริการทางด้านการเงินของสภาผู้แทนราษฎรที่สภาคองเกรสนะครับก็ใช้คำว่าเป็นอีกวันหนึ่งที่ในฝั่งของคุณลุงเจอโรม พาเวลจะต้องมีการตอบซึ่งแน่นอนว่าในฝั่งของคุณเจอโรม พาเวลเนี่ยยังคงต้องมีการตอบคำถามกับอีกทีมหนึ่งใช่กับอีกทีมหนึ่งนะครับฉ ฉะนั้นรอบนี้ก็ต้องรอลุ้นครับว่าจะมีมุมมองอย่างไรและผมเตรียมพอร์ตไปแล้วนะครับแต่บายจะเซลเดี๋ยวค่อยว่ากันและผมจะแอบดูนะ
by the elected representatives of the people, not the central bank. As you said, the Fed needs to stick to its knitting. I agree. There is concern from many that the Fed is picking up new needles and knitting partisan sweaters. At such a precarious time for our economy here at home and the global economy, that would be a mistake. Thank you for being here today. I look forward to your testimony and the questions by our members. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the committee, Ms. Waters, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
มีคำถามด้วยนะครับโอ้โหคุณป้าคนนี้อีกแล้ว
Chairman. Good morning, Chair Powell. Since your last visit, our country, under the leadership of President Biden, has made major progress to improve economic conditions, including adding a record 12 million jobs, reducing unemployment to its lowest rate in 54 years,
ก็พูดถึงประมาณ
while
อั
also
ตราการจ้างงาน
reducing the
12 ล้านตำแหน่ง
deficit by $1.7 trillion.
อัตราการ
Unfortunately,
ว่างงาน
many
สูง
families
ต่ำสุด
are
ใน
still
รอบ
struggling to afford basic
ใน
necessities
รอบ
because of inflation. What's more,
ในรอบ
interest rate
54 ปี
hikes are making borrowing, especially for mortgages,
แต่น่าเสียดาย
outrageously
ครับหลายครอบครัว
expensive.
ยังคงต้องดิ้นรนที่จะ
Since
จ่าย
I raised this concern for you in a
จ่าย
November
จ่าย
letter,
ใช้จ่าย
the
แบบทั่ว
rate
ไป
hikes continue
จากอัตราเงิน
to
เฟ้อ
have
ที่สูง
an outsized impact on housing costs, which are, as you know, a primary driver of core inflation.
อ่า
But, Mr. Chair, I think that you will agree that Congress also has a role. That's why I'm somewhat disappointed that after 2 months, Republicans have taken no serious action
เดี๋ยวปล่อย
to
ให้
address
อันนี้ไปก่อน
inflation.
แล้วเดี๋ยวจะมีการ
This time last
เดี๋ยวจะมีการ
Congress,
ตอบ
House
คำถามนะ
Democrats had passed
เพราะว่า
the
คงไม่อ่าน
American
เอกสารชุดเดิม
Rescue
แล้ว
Plan to provide relief from the ongoing pandemic, which included our committee's efforts to provide $70 billion for homeowners, renters, businesses, and first responders. If Republicans are looking for ideas, committee Democrats have put forth additional bills, like the Build Back Better Act,
บิลแบ็กแบตเตอร์ นะครับ
for Americans,
ก็คือใน
especially
ฝั่งของพรรคเดโมแครตได้นำกฎหมายถึงบิล
even
แบ็กแบต
more
เตอร์นะครับ
concerning. We're just months away from an economic catastrophe beyond what we have ever seen, including spiking interest rates, massive job losses, and global instability. I'm talking about the threats by Republican leadership to force
สั
a
งเกต
default
สังเกตคิ้ว
on our nation's
มา
debt
เต็มเลย
if we don't agree to their demands to cut Social
ได้ไหม
Security, Medicare,
เดี๋ยวก็หาว่ามูลลี่อีก
other
อะ
critical programs. You've urged Congress
ได้ไหมนะ
to take immediate action to raise the debt ceiling. But rather than focusing on this very real issue,
น่าจะได้อยู่
the first bill that committee Republicans brought to the floor
ไม่ได้มูลลี่ครับว่าเหมือน
suggested that Social Security
เดี๋ยว
and
ก็มูลลี่เขาอีก
Medicare are socialist threats to America. Since then, we have considered legislation related to deregulating securities and banking laws and countering threats from China, but Republicans have completely ignored the biggest economic threat to businesses, consumers, and our economy, defaulting on our debt. Last month,
มัน
I
จะมี
wrote
ของ
a letter to Chair McHenry
ของอัน
urging
นี้อีก
him
อันนึงอ่ะ
to
ของ
take this matter
CNBC ไม่
seriously
รู้ว่ามันจะ
and
เสียง
hold
ขนาด
a
ไหน
hearing.
นะครับ
But I'm still waiting for a response. I hope Republicans will listen today to the real consequences
พอๆกันเลย
that even
อันเดียวกัน
the
เลย
mere threat of a default would have for everyone in this country. And finally, I'm so pleased that we're finally making progress on diversity and inclusion for key positions at the Fed, including last year's historic
เดี๋ยวไง
confirmation
กด1 ไลค์ก่อนนะครับ
of
เดี๋ยวเราจะมา
Dr.
ทำการ
to serve as the
แปลแล้วกัน
very first Black woman on the Federal Reserve Board. With the
ขอ
board
อนุญาตแชร์ไปยังฝั่งสปปก่อนนะ
and Kansas City Fed President positions vacant. I think President Biden and Kansas City Fed Board should build on this progress by seriously considering diverse candidates for these positions. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The ranking member yields back the balance of my time, asking him his consent to submit for the record
อย่าตกใจ
my
ดูตัวอย่าตกใจ
letter to Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen from February 28th, asking for an update on the X-date for the debt ceiling. I also ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the latest TBO long-term budget outlook on the unsustainability of our debt, most recently released. And without objection, so ordered. I'll now recognize the Chair of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee Chair, Mr. Barr, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Powell, thank you for being here today to discuss the Federal Reserve's monetary policy actions in a time of economic uncertainty, mixed economic data, historic inflation that continues to plague families and businesses around the country. It is paramount that the Federal Reserve remain vigilant on reducing inflation, anchoring inflation expectations, and restoring price stability at the Fed's 2% target. I also look forward to discussing the Fed's regulatory and supervisory activities. As the Fed reviews the bank capital framework, it needs to consider the impact to the real economy and our global competitiveness when raising capital requirements and sidelining capital would work at cross purposes with monetary tightening, constraining the supply side when we need more, not less,
ก็เป็นการพูดนะครับ
supply chains and reduce inflation.
ที่
Regulations are required of the Fed by law.
เหมือนกับ
One size fits all.
อ่านตามเอกสารที่เขาเขียนมา
Finally, I urge the Fed, in your words, to
สาธยายไม่มีอะไรมาก
climate regulator. I yield back.
Governor's time has expired. We'll now recognize the ranking member of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee, Mr. Foster, for 1 minute.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being here today. Today is the 50th anniversary of when I was first elected to Congress and placed on the Financial Services Committee, just as the economy was about to collapse. And so that was my trial by fire, the emergency response to rescue the economy, and the legislative response, the Dodd-Frank Act, that successfully stabilized our financial system. So 15 years later, as I take my place as the ranking member on the Committee of Oversight of U.S. Banking and Monetary Policy, I recall the solemn oath that I swore to myself back then to make sure that this kind of calamity never happens again. The monetary policy report that we're receiving today is largely a narrative of a return to normal. Lead times to manufacturers are back to pre-COVID levels. The job market retains supernatural strength, and inflation is responding more or less as predicted to the usual measures. And by far, the largest threat on the horizon is a repeat of the 2011 default crisis. Congress has the power to avoid that, and we owe it to the American people to do so. And I yield back.
Today, we welcome the testimony of Jerome Powell, Chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Chair Powell was reappointed, and sworn in for a second four-year term as chair on May 23rd, 2022. Chair Powell also serves as chairman of the Federal Open Markets Committee and the system's principal monetary policymaking, which is the system's principal monetary policymaking body. Chair Powell, we thank you for taking time to be here. We will recognize you for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation or testimony without objection.
ภาพนี้มันเหมือนกับขึ้นเขียงอะ
Chairman McHenry, Ranking Member Waters, and other members of the committee, good morning. And I appreciate the opportunity to present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation is causing significant hardship, and we're strongly committed to returning
ยังพูดเหมือนเดิมครับยังใช้เอกสารชุดเดิมครับ
Over the past year, we've taken forceful actions to tighten the stance of monetary policy. We've covered a lot of ground, and the full effects of our tightening so far are yet to be felt. Even so, we have more work to do. Our policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices. Without price stability, the economy does not work.
ยังใช้เอกสารชุดเดิมครับ
In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period.
ป้าไหวไหมน่ะไม่ไหวก็ลงโพเดียมก่อนก็ได้ไม่ต้องถามแล้วถ้าถามอีกเดี๋ยวทองก็ลงอีกป้า
Review the current economic
ตลอดเวลาเลยแต่ละคน
monetary policy.
ดูปาก
The data from January on
ไม่ได้มูลี่นะป้าไม่เอาไม่ได้จะทำอย่างนั้น
production and inflation have partly reversed the softening trends that we had seen in the data just a month ago. Some of this reversal likely reflects the unseasonably warm weather in January in much of the country. Still, the breadth of the reversal, along with the revisions to the
ถามจริงประธาน
that inflationary pressure
ฟังลุงหน่อยได้ไหมนึกภาพแบบว่าคือมองหน้าลุงหน่อยก็ได้ว่ากูสนใจอ่ะเนี่ยนึกภาพบอกดินึกภาพดิ เฮ้ยระดับโลกนะเฮ้ย
ตื่นหน่อยกูยังตื่นตามเลยระดับโลกขึ้นมาก่อน
has slowed from its peak of 7% in June to 5.4%
โอ้
in
โห
January.
สงสัยง่วง
Energy prices have declined.
มิสเตอร์เฮนรี่สงสัยง่วงไปกินกาแฟก่อนก็ได้นะครับตอนที่ลุงพูดเนี่ย
Past 12 months, core PCE inflation, which excludes the volatile food
น้ำตาจะไหล
and energy
แต่ละคน
was
ตัวตึงเหลือเกิน แต่ละคน
as supply chain bottlenecks have eased and tighter policy has restrained demand, inflation in the core goods sector has fallen. And while housing services inflation remains too high, the flattening out in rents evident in recently signed leases points to a deceleration in this component
ป้าเขาไม่ดูอะไรเลย
of
อะ
inflation.
ป้าดูหน่อย
That said, there is little sign of disinflation
อ๋อ คุณเฮนรี่คุณแม็กผมเรียกว่าแม็กเฮนรี่แล้วกัน
which accounts for more than
อ่านมั้งคงอ่าน
expenditures. To restore price stability, we will need to see lower inflation in this sector, and there will very likely be some softening in labor market conditions. Although nominal wage gains have slowed somewhat in recent months, they remain above what is consistent with 2% inflation and current trends in productivity.
ป้าไม่สนใจอะไรเลยแล้วเดี๋ยวกลับมาปุ๊บป้าถามนั่งงงเลยไม่ใช่งงหรอกกูนี่งงกับป้านี่แหละเขาอะไรมาถาม
Turning to growth, the U.S. economy slowed significantly last year, with real GDP rising at a below-trend pace of 0.9%. Although consumer spending appears to be expanding at a solid pace this
อันนี้คือ
quarter,
เป็นเอกสารชุดเดิมเมื่อวานนี้นะครับ
indicators point to
ทางฝั่ง
subdued
ของ
growth
สภา
in spending and production.
คองเกรสที่อันนี้คือใน
The
ฝั่ง
housing
ของ
sector continues to weaken,
ของฝั่ง
largely
House
reflecting
นะครับ
higher mortgage
ฝั่ง
rates.
House Committee ก็คือ
Higher
ฝั่ง
interest
ของ
rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing
เขาเรียกว่าอะไร
on
นะ
business fixed
คณะกรรม
investment.
การบริการทางด้านการเงิน
Despite the slowdown,
ของฝั่ง
the
ของ
labor
House ครับ
market remains extremely tight. The unemployment rate was 3.4% in January, its lowest level since 1969. Job gains remain very strong in January, while the supply of labor has continued to lag. As of the end of December,
แต่ละคน
there were
ตัวตึง
1.9 job openings for each unemployed individual, close to the
เอาคอมเมน
all-time
ต์ขึ้น
peak
แล้วกัน
reported last
ตึง
year.
มากแต่ละตัวเนี่ยคอมเมนต์เนี่ยนะ
Unemployment insurance claims have remained near historic lows. Turning to monetary policy. With inflation well above our longer-run goal of 2% and with the labor market remaining extremely tight, the FOMC has continued to tighten the stance of monetary policy,
มันได้ความคิดเหรอ
raising interest rates by
ไม่น่านะ
4.5%
เขาก็อ่านเอกสารเหมือนเมื่อวานไม่ได้อ่านเหรอถามจริงไม่ได้อ่านเหรอ
We continue to anticipate that
อ่านหน่อยเฮ้ย
ongoing increases in the target range
อันเดียวกันนั่นแหละ
of the funds rate will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2% over time. In addition, we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size
ทำเหมือน
of the balance sheet.
ในประธาน
We are seeing the effects of our policy actions on demand in the most interest-sensitive sectors of the economy. It will take time for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. In light of the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, the committee slowed the pace of interest rate increases over its past two meetings.
กลายเป็นรายการมูลี่เขา
We'll
ทั้งนั้น
continue to make our decisions meeting by
โอ้
meeting,
น้ำตาจะไหล
taking into account the
สวัสดี
totality of
3,000 ท่านนะครับ
data and their
อย่าหนึ่งแชร์ด้วย วันนี้ลุ้นว่า
economic
จะยังไง
activity. Although inflation has been
ก็ไม่เข้าใจเหมือนกันเนาะว่า ลุงก็พูดเหมือนเดิมแหละ เจ้าเอกสารเหมือนเดิมนี่แหละ
There's a long way to go.
ทำไมไม่ประชุมให้พรุ่งนี้ให้มันจบว่าทำไมต้อง2 วันด้วยวะ
As I mentioned, the latest economic data have come in stronger than expected,
ถูกไหม
which suggests
ไม่เอาประชุมทั้ง2 วันเลยอ่ะ
it's
จริง
likely to be higher than previously.
ไม่เอาประชุมนะ2 วันเลยอ่ะ
If, and I stress that no decision has been made on this, but if the totality of the data were to indicate that faster tightening is warranted, we'd be prepared to increase the pace of rate hikes. Restoring price stability will likely require that we maintain restrictive monetary policy for some time. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal.
ก็ทำไมถึงไม่บอกว่าโอเคแล้วก็เอกสารเมื่อวานมึงถามกูจบแค่นั้นก็พอปะคือมาอย่างนี้โอ้โหมานั่งรออีกแล้วแต่ละคนนี่สนใจเหลือเกินสนใจลุงเหลือเกิน
Loosening policy. We will stay the course until the job is done.
และฝั่งของ
We understand that our actions affect communities, families, and
วอเตอร์
businesses
นะ โอ้
across
โห
the country.
ตัวตึง
Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Federal Reserve will do everything we can to achieve our
คิว
maximum.
ป้าเป็นไดเวอร์เจนไหมครับ
Thank you. Look forward to your
โอ
questions.
เค
Thank you, Chairman Powell.
มาพร้อมพิมพ์พร้อม
I'll
พัน
now recognize myself for 5 minutes for purposes of question. Chairman Powell, there's been a lot of discussion over the last 24 hours about the effect of rate increases on the economy. A lot of debate about what you said yesterday in the Senate. But no one asked you this directly. We have a March meeting coming up. Open markets
มีการถกเถียงกันเมื่อวาน
coming up in
ใน
2
คำพูด
weeks.
เมื่อที่สภา
How do you think about the March meeting? What's your approach to that? What are we likely to see?
Thank you. So I won't repeat what I just said in my testimony.
คิดยังไงกับการประชุมเดือนมีนาคม
In the March meeting, I guess I would say that we have some potentially important data coming up, data to be analyzed. One of them came out at exactly 10 o'clock. That would be the JOLTS report, which of course I haven't seen, having sitting here at 10 o'clock. But we're also getting a jobs report on Friday and a CPI and PPI inflation report next week. So those will be important and we'll scrutinize them. When we say that we're going to be looking at the totality of the data, which is what I said, that does include these reports yet to come. They're going to be important in our assessment of the higher readings that we have very recently received and of the overall direction of the economy and of our progress in bringing inflation down. Again, we have not made any decision about the March meeting. We're not going to do that until we see the additional data.
ลุงบอกว่าเราจะต้องมีการรวบรวมข้อมูลเพื่อเป็นสิ่งที่บ่งชี้ว่ายังจะมีการรายงานเข้ามาเพื่อที่จะเป็นทิศทางโดยรวมของเศรษฐกิจแต่เมื่อวานมึงไม่ได้พูดอย่างนี้
Still the case.
Yes, well, and as I said in my testimony, we look at the data since January and also the revisions to the November and December inflation data, and they suggest that the ultimate level of interest rates is likely to be higher than we'd expected.
And what are those economic factors?
So going back to January, as I mentioned, the softer inflation readings of November and December were revised up. We got a very strong inflation report for January. We got an extraordinarily strong employment report, very strong consumer spending, strong manufacturing data right across the board. As I pointed out, some of that may have been affected by very weather, but nonetheless, all of it pointed in the same direction.
Okay, let's move to regulation. Chair Powell, in January, the Federal Reserve put out a policy statement noting that digital asset custody is a permissible activity if done in a safe and sound manner. However, if a bank can demonstrate to the Fed that it can conduct that activity in a safe and sound manner, the capital impact of the SEC's staff accounting bulletin effectively precludes banks from offering digital asset custody service at any scale. Are you aware of this staff accounting bulletin by the Securities Exchange Commission and its impact on custodial?
อันนี้พูดถึงไอ้ดิจิทัลแอสเซทนะครับยังไม่พูดถึงเกี่ยวกับยังไม่ได้พูดถึงเกี่ยวกับไอ้ฝั่งของเงินเฟ้อนะเมื่อกี้ลุงบอกว่าจำเป็นที่จะต้องมาดูข้อมูลเพื่อที่จะมีการพิจารณาในด้านของทิศทางเศรษฐกิจครับใบเต็มข้อล่อเต็มแข้งเลยครับอาจารย์
letter to the bank
เลื่อนไปแล้วครับ
regulator. So while the Fed says it can be done in a safe and sound manner, the Securities Exchange Commission is regulated.
เมื่อวานไม่ได้พูดอย่างนี้ลุง
Done. Next question is certainly about bank capital standards. You got questions about this yesterday. Chair Barr has announced a holistic review of capital requirements. As I said in my opening statement, there are a lot of questions about this process. And previous statements by members of the Fed governors about the adequacy of current capital standards.
สต็อปร้อนนะถ้าลงมาข้างล่างสุดสต็อปร้อนนะ
Vice Chair for Supervision has announced that the Fed will engage in a holistic review of capital regulation. Is that Fed staff? Is that done at the at the governor's the board level? What is the process? There are a lot of questions that people have about his statements, and so we want to understand why it's necessary for the Fed to conduct a holistic review and what that process is. So, my general question is: Do you still agree with your previous statements about the adequacy on a generalized basis of our financial system? Or are we to read into this that we're not adequately capitalized and there's a high level of risk in the system that we're unaware of at this point?
Thank you. So the why really just is that as a new Vice Chair for Supervision, Vice Chair Barr has launched into, he's taking a fresh look at everything, including capital. That actually is typical of the last two people to have this job. So that makes a lot of sense. In terms of the process, it's certainly conducted under Vice Chair Barr's leadership with input from the staff and discussions with governors on that committee, and I'm kept broadly apprised about what's going on. But the bottom line is nothing has been proposed to the board.
ยังไม่เกี่ยวนะอันนี้เขาแตกในส่วนของคำถามอื่นนะครับไม่ได้แวะนะถ้าแวะปุ๊บนี่ผมจะบอกเลย
When we get to the place where that's appropriate, the board will be carefully briefed. Ultimately, we'll vote on a proposal, and that proposal will go out for comment, and we'll solicit comment from any and all commenters, and we'll look very carefully at that. So it'll be a wide open process in the sunshine.
Thank you. I yield back. Now recognize the gentlewoman from California, the ranking member, Ms. Waters.
Thank you very much. Chair Powell, I agree with what you said on February 1st, that Congress must raise the debt limit because of what you described as the highly risky consequences of failing to do so. You are perhaps the most important expert on the debt limit, which is why I find it very concerning that your recommendation to raise the debt limit in a timely manner is being ignored by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I'm also concerned that the consequences of this brinksmanship are imminent. Ratings said this week that they may seriously look at downgrading the U.S. debt based on the escalating brinksmanship they are observing, even if Congress ultimately addresses the debt limit at the last minute. This is history repeating itself. Standard & Poor's downgraded our debt back in 2011, when Republicans last controlled the House and threatened default. The Bipartisan Policy Center later found that the 2011 debt limit debate cost us $18.9 billion in higher borrowing costs, even though we never defaulted. To put that into perspective, that could have been leveraged to provide up to $200 billion
อันนี้กำลังสาธยายถึงเรื่องหนี้ถึงเรื่องศักยภาพของการทำงาน
credit initiative, or to provide
พูด
hundreds
ถึง
of
นโยบาย
thousands
ของ
of
ทั้งสอง
people
พรรค
down payment assistance
ถกเถียง
to
ถึง
buy
เรื่อง
their
หนี้
first home. So I want to
เท่าไหร่
emphasize
ยังไม่ถึงคำถามนะสาธยายอยู่
including
แต่ทองไปแล้ว
Republicans on this
บายไปแล้วกูไม่สน
had no qualms about paying our debts when Trump was in
หมายสองครับ
Three times they addressed the debt ceiling in a timely manner without holding our country hostage. But Republicans now are ready to tear down the hard work of Americans everywhere to weather the pandemic and build back a strong recovery. Chair Powell, can you describe for us the risk you see if Congress continues to delay action on the debt both for our economy
เพราะดูเหมือนลุงวันนี้ออกแนวกลัว
Let me start briefly by saying that we have no role and seek no role in what is really at the heart of fiscal policy, except I will limit myself to the two things that other Fed chairs have said about this. One is just that Congress raising the debt ceiling is really the only alternative. There are no rabbits in hats to be pulled out on this. Two really is just that no one should assume that the Fed can protect the economy from the non-payment of the government's bills, let alone a debt default or something of that nature, which we don't think will happen here. But no one should be thinking that we have the tools to protect the economy from all the.
เฟดไม่เกี่ยวกับการรับชำระหนี้
Thank you very much. I don't know what you said. I somewhat quoted you when you said that Congress must raise the debt limit because of what you described as a highly risky consequence of failing to do so. Is that your language?
Well, must in the sense that it's really the only way for the debt limit to be raised is Congress must act. Again, these are fiscal discussions, and we don't want to be a part of them. And really, they're between elected officials.
But you are an expert on the subject.
Well, I spent a lot of time on this, as you'll recall.
As an expert on this subject, you are concerned about the high risky consequences of failing to do so.
คุณจรพรคุณคือผู้เชี่ยวชาญคุณ
That's correct.
ต้องใช้เวลามากกับเรื่องนี้คุณลุงจรพรบอกว่าในฝั่งของ debt ceiling ไม่ได้เกี่ยวครับต้องให้สภาคองเกรสจัดการอีกครั้งไม่เกี่ยวครับ
The chair mentioned that he had either written a letter or maybe even had some conversation from Janet Yellen about the time limits that she had attempted to do.
บายไปแล้วขึ้นก่อน
Is it your understanding that she said she could maneuver and kind of manipulate things so that she paid the bills that were coming due, but this could only last until about June? Is that your understanding?
Honestly, I would really have to not try to interpret the secretary's words for you. That's really up to her to do.
Can she keep us afloat until about June?
I don't. So that's not for me to say. These are really questions for the secretary. I'm sorry. Well.
Have you had any conversation with her about the statement that she made about being able to manipulate the debt and pay bills that were coming due out of another account, etc.?
พูดเชื่อมโยงไปถึงคุณป้าเยเลนนะครับ แล้วถามว่าคุณป้าเยเลนคิดยังไงบ้าง
Don't go anywhere. I don't talk about them with anybody. And the conversations I have with Secretary Yellen, I don't.
Okay, and I don't want to get
Gentle lady's time is expired. The gentle lady's time is expired.
Did I have equal time with you?
You sure did. He went over time.
If I did, thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize the vice chair of the full committee.
ถามไม่ได้เกี่ยวเลย
Arkansas.
จัดหนักคุณลุงจะลงซาพาวเวลซะงั้น
Thank you, Chair Powell, for being with us. You're welcome anytime. Don't wait till we ask. If you want to volunteer and come, we love having your views on many topics. Thanks for talking about your commitment to.
เมื่อกี้ป้าเนี่ยพูดถึงว่าคุณลุงไปคุยอะไรกับคุณป้าเยเลนบ้างเพราะคุณป้าเยเลนอยู่อีกฝั่งหนึ่งถูกไหมแล้วฝั่งของเดฟซิลลิงคุยอะไรกันบ้างคุณลุงจะลงผมว่าโทษนะไม่มีสิทธิ์ไม่ได้คุยป้าเขาบอกว่าฉันไม่โอเคเธอเคยคุยกันกับคุณป้าเยเลนใช่เหรอไม่โอเคไม่โอเคไม่โอเค
by this committee. Yesterday in the Senate, you suggested that you supported a regulatory framework, a broadly regulatory framework for digital assets. Is that right?
Yes.
And is it your view that if we had a regulatory framework here in the United States for digital assets, that there'd be more transparency and rules of the road for both consumers, investors, and developers?
Absolutely.
And would it, if we had those rules of the road
ไปดูหุ้นต่างๆขึ้นนะไปดูหุ้นต่างๆขึ้นนะ
and develop blockchain as a potential
ใครอยากอยู่ด้วยกันยาวๆ
technology in their business and tokenized
เพราะตอนนี้
payments
เพราะผมจะยังไม่ได้ยุ่งเรื่องสกุลเงินดิจิตอลครับ
Yes, and to assure that it's all done in a safe and sound manner when we're talking about banks.
Right. And then my next point would be exactly that, to help banks, investment brokers, custodians understand how they could even participate in that market in a safe and sound manner. You agree that a regulatory framework would help on that?
Yes.
And then finally, we've grown up in our country, and it's unique in the world that we have a dual banking system. And due to a quirk here in Congress over 100 years ago, we have insurance is regulated exclusively by the states. So would you believe that regulatory framework would also have to preserve some sort of role subject to safety and soundness, for states, states to play some role in that regulatory framework for digital assets?
แดงละ
Let me just say, I think that the work certainly works in banking and insurance. I have no problem with those.
Right. But you think you consider it possible that it could also work in digital assets?
Certainly possible.
Yeah. Thank you. Turning to a topic that's been a subject here for nearly 4 years, central bank digital currencies. Article 1 of the Constitution reserves coins and coin issuance, money issuance to the Congress. And we've in turn delegated that to the U.S. Treasury, which has, since 1912, engaged the Federal Reserve as their fiscal agent. You've testified here many times before that to issue a central bank digital currency, that would have to be authorized by statute by Congress. Is that still your testimony?
That is absolutely the case.
สวัสดี 3,400 ท่านด้วยนะครับอย่าลืมนะครับใครที่เข้ามาแล้วอย่าลืมกดไลค์กดแชร์ด้วยติดตามช่องนี้ไว้ดีๆตอนนี้ลุงไม่ได้พูดถึงเกี่ยวกับเงินเฟ้อไม่ได้พูดถึงเกี่ยวกับเรื่องงานเพราะเมื่อวานพูดไปแล้วท่านผู้นี้ใช้ชื่ออะไรมิสเตอร์บาร์ป่ะมิสเตอร์บาร์เขาพูดถึงดิจิทัลแอสเซทครับหรือใช้คำว่ามีมุมมองอย่างไรที่เกี่ยวกับดิจิทัลแอสเซทส่วนคุณป้าเมื่อกี้คือมิสวอเตอร์ป่ะมิสวอเตอร์นะ ก็ด่าเลยแค่นั้นเองไม่มีอะไรมากครับ
That's a really good question too.
Yeah.
But it's just something that's literally.
ตอนนี้กูบายไปละจะสต็อปลอสอีกเปล่าไม่รู้
But that speaks that you might have a blockchain between banks and the Fed
ทุก
using
อย่างอยู่ที่คำพูดลุงครับ
digital currency token to settle transactions institutionally inside the yeah. So that leads me to Fed Now, which is supposed to be up and running, I think, this summer, somewhat behind the scene there. I would like to ask you to formally have this full committee briefed on that by the Federal Reserve. I know the chair of the Kansas City Bank was involved. She's now left. And I think the committee has a lot of questions about Fed Now, how its interoperability will work,
งานเข้า
how
กู
it's
ละ
going to roll out. And also just a question that
กลุ่มทองเด้อ
we've been asked that why the Fed wire system isn't up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week now to benefit consumers that are using Venmo. Do you have a thought on that?
กลุ่มทองเด้อ
I'm not sure why we're not 24/7 on that, and we of course be delighted to.
กลุ่มทองเด้อกลุ่มทองเด้อ ท่านไหนที่ยังไม่ได้เข้านะครับไม่เป็นไรครับเพราะกลุ่มแค่เต็ม
And the right person from the Fed. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now recognize the the ranking member of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, Mr. Sherman of California, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for bringing to our committee's attention several years ago the importance of tough legacy LIBOR, some $16 trillion of instruments where the creditor wouldn't know how much the debtor was supposed to pay. This committee, we passed legislation over a year before the LIBOR hit the fan.
นึกว่าลุงจะซักต่อไม่มีใครถามลุงเรื่องเงินเฟ้อเลย
Before the
ไม่มีใครถามลุงถึงเรื่อง
I hope we do this in other areas, and it's my understanding that with those final regulations, we're done, and we've solved the LIBOR.
ถามลุงเรื่องงานหน่อยถามลุงเรื่องตัวเลขเศรษฐกิจว่าเศรษฐกิจไปทางไหนหน่อยเมื่อกี้มึงไม่ถามเมื่อกี้มึงถามนิดเดียวแล้วมึงไปว่าอย่างอื่นทำไม
People talk about inflation, and they somehow say that it's a matter of the personalities and politics in the United States. Others argue that the entire world is hit by inflation because Ukraine and COVID. I think we've got the answer to this question in that inflation is considerably higher in the Eurozone than it is in the United States today. And it's very hard to say that Joe Biden is responsible for inflation in Germany.
พูดถึงการเงินเฟ้อที่เกิดขึ้นจากรัสเซียยูเครน
and the harm that's already done to our economy. We solve the problem tomorrow. We have less investment than we would have had yesterday. And I would say that I commend the president. He's going to issue a budget plan tomorrow. And perhaps in their time, one of our Republican colleagues can tell us when the Republican
ใบไปเต็มข้อเลยล่อเต็มแข้งแดงมาแล้วครับผม
eagerly awaiting it. Housing is a huge part of inflation, and we've left it to local government, but the permitting process there guarantees scarcity, which guarantees high housing costs. Mr. Chairman,
เข้ามาสู่คำถามสักที
we've talked back in 2001 and several times even before that about wire fraud. And having just bought a home, I saw the process up front. Everybody's very nervous about one thing, and that is, will the buyer of the house be tricked into wiring their down payment to the wrong account? Or will the seller, the buyer be tricked into, or the escrow agent be tricked into sending the money to someone other than the seller of the property? We talked
ผู้ซื้อบ้าน
about
ถูกหลอกจ่ายเงินดาวจำนวนมาก
where I urged you with your Fed Now system, which I'm glad is on track to move forward, to have what the Brits have. When you send the wire, you identify not only the number of the account you're sending it to, but also the name of the person or entity that's supposed to receive that. At that time, back in 2001, you said that payee matching is not the best way to do it. There are other ways to do it.
โทษนะมึงเข้าสู่คำถามสักทีได้ไหม
Make sure that an email from a Nigerian prince does not get the wired funds, particularly in a housing transaction, wired to an account number that turns out to be in Lagos. What progress do you have? When can home buyers have a system where they're sending it to a named payee as well as to a number.
So I hope we did come back in a timely way to you on that. But it's a problem you brought to our attention. You're right, over many years, and we continue to focus on that.
Well, the bureaucrats who are working on this don't want to do what the Brits did. They've proven it can be done. You said you were going to accomplish the same goal in some other way, and it has been a while, and it's not solved, nor are you aware of any solution. I would hope that you would go back and say, we don't want to add this anxiety to every real estate transaction. We go back to the drawing boards, follow what the Brits have done, and have payee matching. Finally, as to crypto,
ถามอะไรเนี่ยถามเกี่ยวกับอสังหาไม่ได้เกี่ยวกับเฟดเลยถามทำไม
hidden money. That's what it means.
แล้วแวะมาคริปโต
And if we
สบายใจเลย
impose know your customer and
ห้องกูก็ลงสบายใจเลย
laundering
ถามอย่างอื่น
it won't be crypto anymore. What crypto wants is to have part of its
คืออะไร
ecosystem above the waterline,
โอ้ย
visible,
ตาย
and
ตายกู
subject
ตาย
to
ตาย
know
กู
your
ตาย
customer,
บายเต็มข้อรอดเต็มแข้ง
and the rest of the iceberg below the waterline.
Gentleman's time has expired. I will now go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman McHenry, thank you very much. Chairman Powell, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate not only your professionalism, but your direction at us. Chairman Powell, I know that the Fed considers divergence.
ไม่ใช่วันของกูอีก
You
แล้ว
talked about it as you spoke in your opening statement about consumer price index, personal consumer expenditures, inflation,
แหมหนูสวนจานรอด
GDP,
แต่ละตัว
and all these things are talked about in your report, monetary report of March 3, 2023. Thank you. A couple days ago, I had an opportunity to see that an economist, Arthur Laffer, produced a report that spoke about literally this country doubling GDP. Now, I know we're putting CPI, PCE, inflation, all these things into a mix. But he said that if we made changes in healthcare to efficiencies, we could double the current GDP rate. My question to you that I hope you can answer is, what do you think about that? Is that something that is in this document that I have missed? And it's seemingly to a person who follows this, as Art Laffer does for 50 years. What do you think is an important way to look at efficiencies in healthcare? Thank you.
So no, that's not in our monetary policy report.
วันนี้พูดถึง
I'll just say
ฝั่ง
one
ของ
thing, and that is we do
สุขภาพ
spend something like 17 or 18 in that range % of GDP delivering healthcare.
พูดถึง healthcare
Other similarly wealthy countries spend 10%. So it's the delivery system. It's not that the benefits are incredibly rich or anything like that. It's just that the delivery system is very expensive. That's $1 trillion a year that we spend and get nothing for it. This is fiscal policy, but I'm responding to your. So I would think that he may have meant that if we had a delivery system that saved that $1 trillion that doesn't really.
คำถามไม่ได้มีประโยชน์ประยำอะไรกับเขาเลย
Great for the economy.
แต่ละตัว
So you've spoken of supply chain disruptions because it in fact is an inhibitor or an accelerator as we gain that advantage. You just talked about some seemingly which would offer some validation to Mr. Laffer as he spoke about the huge importance of this. Is that something you should start paying attention to where policy people, not only at the Fed, but your Fed banks around the country would start looking at and start putting pressure on us to gain those efficiencies as a result of a global view?
So on supply chains generally, they have suddenly been tremendously important in inflation, as you know, for the last couple of years. And for the first
โทษ
time,
นะ ถ้าพวกคุณมีหน้าที่แค่มาเล่าอะไรให้กูฟัง มึงกลับเหอะ จริง กับ thank you พดงอน see you later ก็ว่าไป thank you ไปเลย you please thank you โอเคจะโชว์อะไรก็ถามดิมันควรที่เป็นเรื่องถามป่ะก็ที่ฝั่งของเฟดก็คือใครก็คือธนาคารกลางสหรัฐไหมอะไรของคุณแล้วเมื่อกี้ไปแตะตรงที่กูดอยอยู่ข้างบนเนี่ย2 ไม้เนี่ยใครรับผิดชอบใครจะรับผิดชอบ
Just love to have you go back. Perhaps we from this committee need to give you some direction on that. But I think you've
อยากเห็นหน้าลุงเดี๋ยวผมขอดูฝั่งของ CNBC ก่อนจะเห็นไหม
staggering impact on that. I don't think it's political. The answer may be political. Those efficiencies, the actual numbers are not political. It's an inefficiency.
ก็ไม่ได้แพลนหาลุงเหมือนมา
Regional matter.
ดูหน้าลุงบ้าง
I wanted to get your take on that, and I appreciate you being here as always. Thank you for your confidence and your hard work that you give this country. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Someone yields back. We'll now recognize the ranking member of that.
แต่อันนี้ช้ากว่า
Mr. Scott of Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
ช้ากว่า CNBC ช้ากว่าครับช้ากว่าแต่ซูมไปซูมมาเหมือนกันนะ
Now, Chairman,
อันนี้คืออันนี้
listen to me very carefully here, because I think we're on the verge of
CNBC ยังเป็นคุณเซ็กซันอยู่เลยอ่ะ
terrible
คุณซิกซัน
Back in
ชื่อวะ
2008,
ซิซัน
if
ใช่ไหม
you
ซิซัน
recall, Barney Frank then and Miss Waters asked me to take a look and kind of work with you and the Fed. You were a board member in 2008. And we came to the conclusion that we needed a more equitable playing field between our large banks, like Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, and our regional and smaller banks, like Truist and our community banks.
มีแรงไหมลุง
And we
เหมือน
changed.
จะหายใจเหนื่อย
But now I hear that the Fed and the FDIC plan to drop a new rule
เหมือนจะเหนื่อยนะ
which seeks to
หายใจหน่อยก็ได้ หายใจปุ๊บแล้วค่อยพูดก็ได้
long-term and higher capital
แล้ว
requirements
ก็
that
ถามอะไรไม่ได้เรื่องอีกแล้ว
and you and I did this back in 2008, and you remember.
แต่ละตัวนี้ตึงมากเลย
Created for the Goldman Sachs and for them.
ดูแล้ว
And now we want to apply these rules to the
บอกตรงเหนื่อยแทน
region.
ครับเหนื่อยแทน
There's a big difference. And we've omitted this difference if you proceed in this
เอ๊ะ
manner.
หรือลุงเมา
I think it's very misguided. It works. And you and I worked on this. You recall this. You were a board member. And we saw that we needed to have a better playing field to protect. And if you all go along with this, it could put many of our regional banks and small community banks out of business. So I want you to reverse this. First of all,
บอกตรงนะ ตอนนี้ผมหายใจเริ่มเหนื่อยละกูเริ่มเหนื่อยตัวเองละกูเริ่มเหนื่อยละเริ่มเหนื่อยละโอ้ยเหนื่อย
smaller and regional
เหนื่อยเลยอะ
under the same heavy or financial load as your large worldwide banks? Tell me.
No,
And
we're not
Mauro.
planning that. We
Well-
believe strongly and always have in tailoring to address the different size and risk characteristics of financial institutions. And certainly nothing like that for the regionals. They won't have anything like what the very large, most systemically important banks have in terms of overall regulation.
Yeah, because I remember clearly you and I were back, I think we were on this side then, talking about this in this same committee room. And you worked with us on that. I'm glad to hear that. Where is that coming from? I mean, it's a concern. It's just a rumor. Have there been any discussions about removing the playing field
YouTube
and the guardrails
Yahoo Finance ใช่ไหม
the
เร็วไหม
differentiations in the requirements between the regional banks, community banks, and your larger global banks.
So,
There's nothing to that.
well, I would say this: we're required by the law now, and we're doing this. Dodd-Frank actually required us.
Yes.
Suggested that we should tailor, and then the S2155 then required it, and anything that we do will reflect
ที่นี่เร็วที่สุดอะ
appropriate tailoring.
All right, so we that's off the board. We're not going to change and put the smaller and regional banks
We're doing this
under the same
Dodd-Frank actually
financial obligation role as the large banks. We got that right from
then
you,
required
correct?
it, and yeah, that's right.
All right, good. Now let me turn to China. I'm really worried about China, and right now people may not know it, but China is the world's largest economy in terms of purchasing power. Now, at our last meeting, I talked about this move where we didn't blow the balloon up. And this is an example of what I was pointing out.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now recognize the chair of the Science Committee, Mr. Lucas of
ที่
Oklahoma.
นี่เร็วกว่าที่สุดแล้วครับ
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, I'd like to follow up on the topic
ฟอก
of
นี่เร็วสุดแล้ว
capital.
ที่เหลือดีเลย์หมดเลย
These things we've discussed many times together.
อยู่Yahoo Finance ก็ดีเลย์
You know, commodity markets have seen significant volatility in the last few years. And during times of economic uncertainty, like we've seen, end users turn to the markets to hedge risk, particularly those in the agriculture and the energy sectors. And I know that the Fed is early in the review process of potential changes in capital requirements. Can you, well, I'll ask anyway. Can you commit to ensuring that these changes will not increase the cost for banks providing those commodity derivatives to end users?
That's a really specific. Can I go look at that? I mean, I'm not actually sure that the work even addresses that. So,
Fair point.
To come back to you on that.
And that particular response makes me feel better. Because after all, those products are very important to my folks and make a great deal of difference in how they're able to address their issues. So, as you discussed earlier, and as you've consistently assured, the Fed's not a climate-making policymaker. You and I have talked about this issue, again, many times in the past. However, I'm concerned that the Fed could be heading in that direction and could be laying the groundwork for climate-related stress tests.
อันนี้พูดถึง climate change อีกอะ
sectors of the economy.
ไม่ได้แตะแบบตรงๆเลยนะ
Will not the Federal Reserve
climate change เพื่ออะไร
political pressure and force the Fed, in fact, make policy decisions related to climate change. We've seen, for example, this administration turn to regulators to impose climate policy as an alternative to the legislative process. Chairman Powell, how careful are you in ensuring that the Fed does not place itself into the climate debate? And how can Congress ensure that the Fed's regulatory toolkit is not, shall we say, warped into creating climate policy outcomes?
So, I think we do have a narrow.
คำถามง่ายๆเลยก็คือมันจะมั่นใจได้ยังไงว่าจะไม่เข้าร่วมอภิปรายเกี่ยวกับ climate change ครับและสภาคองเกรสจะมั่นใจได้อย่างไรว่าชุดเครื่องมือกำกับดูแลของเฟดเนี่ยมันคือสิ่งที่ไม่ใช่ถามทำไม ถามสถานะการทำงานเขาเพื่ออะไรถามเกี่ยวกับเศรษฐกิจครึ่งปีแรกครึ่งปีหลังสิครับ
I would completely agree with you.
กูติดบาอยู่ครับ
That border needs to be very carefully guarded.
เมื่อกี้แตะแล้วทำไมไม่แตะต่อครับ
I will do that as long as I'm border governor.
ตอนเนี้ยโอ้โหแอร์เย็นมากเลย
Because again,
รู้สึก
it's a very
ร้อนๆหนาวๆ
important
นี่
issue
ก็
in the 3rd District of Oklahoma. Traditional production agriculture, oil and gas, and the actions that the Fed takes have a significant impact back home. So it's vital that we resist the demands to do that sort of thing now or in the future. And I very much appreciate that response. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts, the ranking
ไม่
member
มี
that
ประ
did
โยชน์
last
ไปยำอะไรเลยแต่ละตัว
is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for your willingness to come here and to update us. Last week, the Treasury Department announced that leaders from Treasury would begin to meet regularly with leaders from the Fed and from the White House to discuss a possible CBDC, central bank digital currency, and other payment innovations. In the statement, it was mentioned, and I'll quote from it, it said that the Fed is encouraged to provide periodic public updates as it continues its research and its technical experimentation on central bank digital currencies. I was wondering, first of all, when you might be expecting to share some of these public updates. What's the timing on that?
So we did go out for
จะไปพูดถึงเรื่องสกุลเงินดิจิตอลทำไม เพื่ออะไร จะพูดถึงนวัตกรรมของเขาไปทำไม เขาจะทำอะไรก็เรื่องของเขา บอกว่าอัปเดตได้ไหมในส่วนของการทดลองเกี่ยวกับสกุลเงินดิจิตอลเพื่ออะไรคุณ
Boston Fed has a partnership there.
มันแบบเกี่ยวอย่างสักอย่างนี่แหละ
Folks from MIT Media Lab that doing a great job, but you know, it says here that the discussions would include technical experimentation. I was just wondering at what level are you talking about making decisions on architecture for a CBDC, a retail CBDC?
We're not at the stage of making any real decisions. What we're doing is experimenting in kind of early stage experimentation. How would this work? Does it work? What's the best technology? What's the most efficient?
พูดอะไรเกี่ยวกับสกุลเงินดิจิตอลมันไม่ได้เกี่ยวอะไรกับฝั่งของการทำนโยบายครึ่งปีหลังเลยมึง
You know, we haven't decided that this is something that the financial system in the country want or need. So that's going to be very important.
Right. Well, I think I speak for the chairman as well. Would love to have more dialogue.
คืออะไรที่มันไม่เกี่ยวเนื่องกับนโยบายครึ่งปีแรกครึ่งปีหลังกราฟจะนิ่งๆกูดันบายไปซะงั้น
Let me switch over to Fed now. There's some champions of digital currency and stable coins in particular that continue to cite the need for faster payment systems. However, as was earlier mentioned, the Fed now the Fed is working on to finalize that will allow for instant payments between bank accounts. And the Fed has a target release date for Fed now between May and July, which is right around the corner. Do you see any reason why cryptocurrencies would provide faster payments than the Fed now system? And would this offer, with the transparency of Fed now, would it offer distinct advantages over some of these stable coins that are
พูดถึงระบบ Fed Now
faster payments?
What Fed Now will do is it will
Fed Now เขาเรียก Fed Now นะครับในการชำระเงินที่เร็วกว่าระบบ Fed Now ก็คือในฝั่งของไอ้คริปโตเคอเรนซี
available funds and real-time payments to their customers. That's what it will do. That's a great thing. You know, a CBDC. I think you're asking whether a CBDC would serve some of that. A CBDC is going to be years in the evaluation, and you know, I think we can get this into the hands of the public very quickly, and I think we'll have real-time payments in this country very, very soon. And so that's a good thing.
It is.
จบได้แล้วลุงจบได้แล้ว
I have an overriding question. That is, you know, before the greenback.
เขาให้5 นาทีเลยแล้วลุงจับเวลาอยู่เนี่ยจับเวลาอยู่เนี่ยเลยละลมเสียไม่เคยโกรธลมเสีย
But when the greenback came out, all of those various currencies went to zero because everyone had, you know, because the greenback had the full faith and credit of the United States behind it. I'm worried about a lot of these stable coins and other cryptocurrencies. Do they go to zero when we come up with a CBDC that has the full faith and credit of the United States behind it? And we've got thousands of these out there, and you've got people investing millions and millions of dollars in these, well, trillions right now. And I'm just thinking if we had those advantages built into a CBDC, wouldn't those alternatives go to zero if they did not have the transparency and the full faith and credit that we enjoy?
So certainly unbacked cryptocurrencies that don't have any intrinsic value
ก็ตอบด้วยนะ
for a positive number
ไม่ใช่หน้าที่เลยนะลุง
Those who have never understood the valuation of those
ดู
stable coins
ผู้
are
หญิงท่านผู้หญิงข้างหลัง
many of them are really
กูมาฟังเงิน
they're
เฟ้อ
they're drawing
กูมาฟัง
from
inflation
the dollar. They have
มึงมาคุยถึงเรื่อง
their
คริปโต
dollar
ทำไม
dollar
ดูทำสีหน้า
reserves, although we don't know what's in the reserves because there's no regulation.
Gentleman's time has expired.
นี่ว่ามองลอย
Mr. Lukemeyer is recognized for 5 minutes. The chair of the National Security Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Chairman Powell, for being here this morning. The reserve currency status of the dollar to the U.S. has enormous financial and national security benefits. In the wake of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, the Fed took action to prevent the Kremlin from accessing more than $300 billion in reserves, roughly half of Russia's reserves. However, this led to an accelerated effort by countries like China to de-dollarize their official foreign exchange reserves. This last week, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal titled
พูดถึงเงินสำรอง 3,000 ล้านดอลลาร์ ที่ฝั่งของรัสเซียยูเครนนะครับจะดำเนินการเข้าถึงเงินสำรองของสหรัฐ
Jinping published for the settlement of energy push for the settlement of energy trades in the Chinese yuan at a summit with Arab leaders in December. The question is, are you concerned about these actions by Russia and China to push to establish different reserves and conduct transactions in non-U.S. dollars?
So the U.S. dollar is
คำถามคือกังวลไหมเกี่ยวกับการกระทำของรัสเซียและจีนที่ผลักดันให้สร้างทุนสำรองที่แตกต่างในการทำธุรกรรมในสกุลเงินที่ไม่ใช่สกุลเงินดอลลาร์สหรัฐมันไม่เกี่ยวกับเฟด
So other countries who are competing on other planes
มันไม่เกี่ยวกัน
to establish
กังวลแล้วทำอะไรได้
really the
เอาระเบิดไปลงรัสเซียหรือจีนเหรอมันไม่ใช่
national commerce because we have those aspects and other countries don't.
Well, that's true to now, but my question is, are you concerned about the actions of these countries because if they see themselves being challenged or are concerned, for instance, if China would invade Taiwan, as Russia invaded Ukraine, there were some sanctions put on. I don't disagree with the sanctions. The last time you were here, though, Mr. Chairman, I asked a question because it's an instructive moment for us from the standpoint that knowing that we put sanctions on Russia, all their different accounts, as well as oligarchs from that country, are we thinking about doing the same thing with China when they invade Taiwan? And your answer at that point was no.
เช่นถ้ารัสเซียบุกถ้าจีนบุกไต้หวันคุณรู้ไหมว่ารัสเซียบุกจีนเนี่ยมีการคว่ำบาตรบ้างไม่เกี่ยวคือไม่ได้เห็นด้วยกับการคว่ำบาตรในครั้งล่าสุดแต่คุณอยู่ที่นี่ประธานถามคำถามเป็นช่วงเวลาที่ให้คำแนะนำกับเราเขาไม่ได้มีสิทธิ์มีเสียงในการยุ่งกับรัสเซียยูเครนมันคนละเรื่องละ
So have you started thinking about that at all yet?
Well, we say the business of sanctions is entirely in the hands of the elected government and the Treasury Department. We are an implementer as it relates to banks. That's it.
Yeah, but we're going to take your advice on the different aspects of this, Mr.
Sorry?
We're going to take your advice on the different aspects of this.
Well, I mean, honestly, when the sanctions were being put in place, Treasury was doing it. We weren't doing it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the way it works.
คุณลุงก็บอกว่ากูคือกูเกี่ยวเนื่องกับทางด้านธนาคารนั่นแหละจะให้คำแนะนำเกี่ยวข้องต่างๆมันไม่ได้เข้าใจไหม
The problem that we have here with the Fed's balance sheet says that hedge fund whose long-term assets are financed by short-term borrowing, and the bottom line is that it's going to cost money. The Fed now has a negative income as a result of having to do this. And so it says here that the Fed will simply borrow the money to pay the bills. Is this true? That we're having the Fed's losing money right now as a result of the way you've got these debt borrowings that you've purchased structured?
The place I would start is that the Fed has, we always turn over all of our earnings in every year. We turn them over on an ongoing basis, and we've turned over something like $1.2 trillion in earnings just in the last, decade or so. So we always know that when we raise interest rates, you're going to lose money.
Okay. Of course, you agree with the point that we have a negative income right now. And
that's
right. This makes my point to my next question, or my concern is, the CFPB gets their money. The CFPB gets their money to run their agency from the Fed.
That's right.
So basically, there's no money for the Fed to pay the CFPB's bills if this is the case, unless you continue to borrow, which is basically what's going to happen now. Is you're going to have to borrow money to be able to pay the CFPB's bills. Is that not correct?
No, we don't borrow money. we issue, basically, yes, we don't shut down the Fed when we have negative income.
Okay.
We can pay our bills and we can pay.
So my follow-up question then is, do you do any accountability or assessing of the CFPB's spending of these dollars at all?
No, we don't.
So they just get a blank check. You just told me they just got a blank check. They send you a bill, you send them a check. There's no accountability for them.
I think there are limits built into the law, which I don't have in the front of my head.
I have yet to see a limit, Mr. Chairman. I'd love to see what the limits are because I don't think that they've ever agreed to have that. But I see my time is up. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now go to Mr. Foster, the
ก็ไม่ได้เรื่องอยู่ดี
monetary.
Thank you. And just a quick comment. I think it's a mistake to imagine that you can
ไม่เรื่องอยู่ดีก็คือเขาพูดไปถึงนู่นน่ะ
effects of technology in your scenario.
ไม่เกี่ยวแล้วกันนะ
If we just talk briefly about healthcare costs, obesity half of our healthcare costs, and there are treatments in these GLP-1 receptor agonists that look like they're just a home run against obesity. And so these will be near-term impacts, which will have macroeconomic effects. So just a comment. I hope you have a certain fraction of futurists in the room when you're talking about your scenario planning, because a lot of that future is like now. Okay, back to economics. So we have this historically low unemployment rate, 3.4%. And historically, this would be considered to drive runaway inflation. Your predecessor, Alan Greenspan,
พูดถึงอัตราการว่างงานนะครับ
referred to dangerously low levels of unemployment. And yet we see inflation is coming down. So what is going on here? How can we have these historically low levels of unemployment without having inflation take off? Is it possible that we simply have less frictional unemployment in our system, due perhaps to the fact that people get their new jobs online and have a job lined up before they quit?
So inflation is coming down, but it's very high is the thing. And some part, I've never said all of it or most of it, but some part of the high inflation that we're experiencing is very likely related to an extremely tight labor market. Wages affect prices and prices affect wages. So I do think that's part of it. More to your point, though, there was a time when there was a tight relationship between inflation and unemployment. In other words, the Phillips curve was steep, and that went away over the period of the Great Moderation. And really, in our thinking, that's because people came to expect 2% inflation, and we had 2% inflation, and then people just stopped focusing on inflation and it stayed very low. So there was really no relationship or very, very tiny relationship. We could have very weak economic growth or very strong economic growth, and we wouldn't have inflation respond very much. That was before the pandemic, though.
Okay, I hope you don't overlearn some of the lessons there. It's one of my worries that there've been a number of exogenous shocks to the system here, and it'll take a while to go through them. And if you want to be careful there. Now, in a related issue, when you say you refer to the totality of factors, you're looking at a mixture of leading and lagging in this totality of factors. And my question, perhaps you might be paying too much attention to the lagging indicators and not enough to the leading indicators. The example that's referenced in your remarks and is in more detail in the report about the difference between using current rental payments versus the amount that you pay for a new rental contract, and difference in how much they lag. Had you paid more attention, for example, to the leading indicators like current rental contracts, then you probably would have picked up inflation earlier. You would have been not gotten so far behind the curve on that. And secondly, there are policy implications going forward. If you look at current rental prices for new contracts, we're much farther along in fixing inflation, and that you can take your foot off the brake. And so what's your thinking on that, and whether you may perhaps be systematically not paying enough attention to leading indicators versus lagging ones?
We've had our eyes on the whole housing inflation thing from the very beginning, and right now, what I would say is that every forecaster is baking in lower rent increases. That's a big part of why people think inflation is going to come down in 2023. I think the thing with transitory was more had to do with goods, and it had to do with the thought that these supply side disruptions would go away much quicker than they would, that the labor market disruptions would go away much quicker than they did. And in hindsight, it just took much longer for those disturbances to go away.
And so with hindsight, if you allow yourself to Monday morning quarterback yourself, you probably would have gone up to
ลุงบอกว่าเงินเฟ้อลดลงคิดว่าชั่วคราวจบแล้วกู
And so what is your are there structural things you can contemplate or even after action reviews to say what would have happened if we would have paid more attention to the leading indicators or improve the band in engineering term, improve the bandwidth of your feedback regulator. And so that this is something if you want to get the best result, you need a high bandwidth feedback in the system even when there's averaging on the back end.
So this is something we only think about during waking and sleeping hours, as you can imagine. It's really hard to know what the lessons are. Again, we really thought things would. Nobody had seen the supply chains collapse. No one had seen labor force participation plummet. We didn't know, or unemployment go to 14% and higher than that. Really, we didn't know how long it would take to go away. And if we ever see this pitch again, we'll know how to swing at it. But it's been
we'll now recognize the
bunch of firsts.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman, its time has expired. We'll now go to the gentlewoman from Missouri, the chair of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, Ms. Wagner, for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Chairman McHenry and Chair Powell. Welcome.
เมื่อกี้ถามอะไรวะกำลังจะไปแวะถามถึงเรื่องงานตัดบทซะงั้น
Hear you discuss how inflation is severely hurting the working people in America. In your testimony, you also state that strong wage growth is good for workers, but only if it is not eroded by inflation. And that is key. Inflation is a tax, a hidden tax on every American. If the Federal Reserve were to shirk its mandates to stabilize prices, leaving inflation alarmingly high, what would it cost America's hard-working families in Missouri's 2nd Congressional District and beyond?
So I think the costs of failure to restore price stability would be extremely high. And while there will be costs to success, the cost of failure will be much higher. You'd be looking at an extended period where people learn to expect and live with high and volatile inflation. And it's very, very hard to have rising real incomes during such a period. So it'd be a bad thing for the country.
Can you reassure the committee that the Fed remains committed to bringing prices down for our constituents?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
I hereby assure you.
And changing topics here a bit, as China's economy reopens and about 18% of the world's population resumes its consumption of oil and other key goods, what sort of inflationary impact will we see here in the United States, sir?
So a stronger, faster reopening.
ป้าผู้หญิงท่านผู้หญิงท่านนี้ถามว่าเฟดยังคงมุ่งมั่นที่จะมีการปรับลด pricing ใช่ไหมเฟดตอบ yes ทองลงเลยกู
So those would be offsetting effects.
โมโห
Sitting here today, we don't expect the net effect to be big. For the United States, it might be bigger for other parts of the world, but we think it ought to be moderate overall.
China is one of the world's top oil importers. And do you expect any inflationary effects on global energy markets as China's oil consumption returns to their previous levels?
So I think oil prices could be affected, and I think that's a big concern in Europe, for example. We have our own domestic oil, and we've got a lot of natural gas as well.
We sure do. I wish we were actually harvesting more of that liquid natural gas. Chair Powell, you, Vice Chair Barr, and many others have recently identified that the banking system is well capitalized and strong. Bank capitalization remained robust during the shock of the pandemic and related shutdowns of economic activity. Capitalization of large financial institutions weathered severe stress testing mandated by the Fed. And despite all of that, as also previously mentioned by Chairman McHenry, Vice Chair Barr insists on conducting a review of capital rules. I'm concerned that this review is being conducted in a silo and that the findings will not be made fully available to the public. Taking such an approach in the context of this holistic capital requirement review would make it impossible to conduct a transparent rulemaking process, denying the public information necessary to consider and to comment. I think this is just simply not appropriate in this situation, and I'm concerned by the lack of clarity, I think is the best word, perhaps at this point, by the vice chair. A couple questions. You've served on the Fed board for over 10 years since the financial crisis regulatory framework has been put in place. And over that period, have you seen any real-world evidence that America's banks are undercapitalized?
So American banks are strongly capitalized, and I believe Vice
คุ
Chair.
ณเคยเห็นหลักฐานโลกแห่งความเป็นจริงบ้างหรือไม่
Yes.
The point is there haven't been any real proposals to evaluate yet, and when there are, that will be done in a highly transparent manner.
I hope so, Trent. I'm glad to hear you say in a highly transparent manner. Do you agree that excessively high capital levels constrain banks' lending capacity with spillover effects on jobs and living standards for Americans?
I think it's always a balance, right? More capital means more safety and soundness and more ability to withstand terribly stressful periods. But it also, it's more expensive. Equity capital is more expensive. U.S. banks have competed incredibly well around the world.
Yes, they have.
High levels.
International.
But so that's a trade-off that you're always going to be making when you think about capital.
My time is expired. Yes, thank you.
We'll now recognize the gentlewoman from Ohio, the ranking member of the National Security Subcommittee, Ms. Beatty. Ms. Beatty, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I like that title.
อย่าลืมนะครับติดตาม Twitter ด่วนเลย
Being such a good
ชื่อนี้เด้อ
friend. I have a couple questions I'm going to try to get through quickly. Chair Powell, in a press conference last month, you stated, quote, there is a lot of spending coming into the construction pipeline, both private
ผู้ที่ฝรั่งประเด็นนะครับ
and so that
แล้วจะต้องมีผู้ติดตาม 62,000 ก่อนนะ ติดตามก่อนครับ ข้อมูลสำคัญอยู่ที่นี่ ที่เดียวเท่านั้น
pipeline of funding from what the Democrats put together in passing the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, and the CHIPS Science Act will do to have economic activity this year and moving forward.
So I guess I was making the point that there are a lot of sources of demand that we can rely on, even though demand has been relatively increasing at a relatively modest rate. Part of it is.
Will this help in that demand?
Yes, I mean there is state and local governments I mentioned are about.
So would you say this is a great thing that we've done? Coming from the left over here.
Not for me to judge the merits of what gets done, but I'm just saying there's.
But it will contribute.
That will support economic.
And support it. Yeah. So I'm going to assume from that that's a positive. Let me go to the second question. Chairman Powell, the Federal Open Markets Committee is projecting that unemployment will increase to 4.6% by the end of the year. And those costs, as we know, won't be borne equally. If we look at the ratio from the last time unemployment was 4.6% and compare it to our numbers now, it would mean that white unemployment would go up to about 0.9, but black unemployment would go up by 2.3%. Does that sound somewhat accurate to you?
ทำไมคาดการพูดถึงในการขึ้นดอกนะทำไมคาดการในการที่อัตราการว่างงานถึง 4.6% ในฝั่งของการคาดการณ์ที่ผ่านมาใน Economic Projection
In this book with your signature on it is stated, however, while disparities in unemployment have largely returned to pre-pandemic levels, there still remain significant disparities in absolute levels of employment across groups like African Americans and Hispanics. So can you address that?
I can. So right now, to your point, actually, African American unemployment is, I think, 5.4%.
ผมทวิตไปบ้างแล้วนะครับข้อมูลสำคัญ
As low as it's been since we started tracking it in 1972.
But differential from majority by.
I'm going to say so that's 5.4, whereas the overall is 3.4, and that includes black. So that means for whites is well lower than that. What happens is, so there's a persistent gap between black and white unemployment, and also when unemployment goes up quickly in a recession, it goes up much faster for African Americans. When the economy grows again, it comes down faster. So that's just that's somehow embedded in our economy. We don't really have the best thing we can do is achieve stable prices so that we can have long expansions. And what happens in those long expansions, the labor market gets tight, sustainably tight, and we have historic lows in unemployment, including for African Americans.
Let me say thank you, and let me also again thank you. As you know, in the 117th, I was the chair of the D&I committee, and let the record state that you always push for making sure that you understood and respected.
ยังไม่ใช่ประเด็นที่มันจะทำให้ราคาต่างๆเบี่ยง
personal to me. In this
ยังไม่ใช่ในประเด็นที่จะทำให้ราคาต่างๆเบี่ยงเลย
I would like to see the areas that talks about unemployment not under a title of special topics, but something that draws a little more attention to it as some of the others.
ผมทวิตบางอย่างไปนะครับ
Last question I have. Can you tell me if the Feds is committed to working with the other agencies like the FDIC and the OCC to finalize a rule soon on CRA? Certainly that's something of great interest to many of my colleagues. So can you give us any updates on it or how the process is going or what we can expect?
Yes. So with Governor Brainerd's departure from the White House, I've asked Vice Chair Barr to take the lead in moving it forward. There's this, I would characterize it that there's
ก็
essentially
เฟด
agreement
มุ่งมั่นจะทำงานกับหน่วยงานอื่นไหม
on the changes to be made. That's all being written up and vetted. And at a certain
แค่นั้น
point,
คำถามหลัก
members of the Board of Governors will be briefed on it. We'll vote on it.
Is there anything we can do to help with that?
No, I think we're hard at work on it, and it's going to take some months, but I think we're nearing we can see the airport, and we'll be landing.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky, the chair of the Financial Institutions and Monetary Policy Subcommittee, Mr. Barr, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman McHenry and Chairman Powell. Economic data are mixed, as you know. On the one hand, low unemployment, robust hiring, strong consumer spending, and persistent core inflation, and a CPI that's still more than 3 times your 2% target.
พูดถึงว่าตอนนี้ข้อมูลเศรษฐกิจไม่ตรงกันนะครับมิสเตอร์บาร์เขาบอก
On the other hand, because the Fed misjudged the inflationary impact of Democrats' overspending, kept interest rates too low for far too long, and failed to end quantitative easing soon enough, the Fed has been forced to raise the Fed funds rate 450 basis points in just 11 months and reduce the M2 money supply at the fastest rate since the 1930s. As a result, wage gains have slowed, credit card debt is at an all-time high, the housing market is in a slump.
ก็คือเอาง่ายๆคือพรรคเดโมแครต
I agree with you that the historical record cautions
การใช้จ่ายทำให้อัตราดอกเบี้ยต่ำเกินไปนานเกินไป
But what would
และล้มเหลว
you say to those who caution about
ในการยุติมาตรการผ่อนคลายเชิงปริมาณหรือมาตรการผ่อนคลายทางการเงิน
the precipitous
ถูกบัง
decline
คับให้เอฟเฟกต์เรท
will the
ขยับ
economy
ตัวขึ้นไปจนถึง
in
4.5
order
basis
to
point
bring inflation down to 2%?
We are very well aware of the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation. Those are long and variable, and I would stress highly uncertain. There is really no agreement on exactly how long they are, but we know that slowing down the pace of rate hikes this year is a way for us to see more of those effects as they come in.
In December, most Fed officials expected to lift rates this year to between 5 and 5.5%. Is that still your estimated terminal rate, or does the data suggest that the terminal rate could be higher than 5%?
Colleagues and I will write down new forecasts and release them to the public on March 22. But as I mentioned in my testimony, the data we've seen so far this year suggests that the ultimate level of rates will need to be higher. But we still have some more data to come in between now and the meeting. But as of today, it suggests a higher level than that.
Let's go to Vice Chairman Barr's review of the capital framework. A lot of questions for you on that. When Governors Brainerd, Quarles, Clarida,
ในฝั่งของเฟดเขาบอกว่าทางฝั่งของสมาชิกเฟด ได้มีการเขียนการคาดการณ์ใหม่และจะเผยแพร่ต่อสาธารณชนในวันที่22มีนาก็คือวันที่มีการประกาศขึ้นอัตราดอกเบี้ยก็คือในฝั่งของ economic projection นะครับตามที่ได้กล่าวไว้ในการให้การข้อมูลที่จะได้เห็นในปีนี้บ่งชี้ว่าระดับการสูงสุดของการขึ้นอัตราดอกเบี้ยต้องสูงขึ้นอีก
We are a consensus organization.
Would that be a break from your prior practices? You're a consensus builder, Mr. Chairman. You pride yourself in that, and we credit you for being a consensus-oriented chairman. Will you commit to continuing that practice and not allow major changes to the bank capital regulatory framework to be made by one person?
They can't be made by any one person, but I do commit to that, and I commit to doing everything I possibly can to bring people together in consensus, to have something that can be broadly supported.
Thank you. Earlier this year, you said, and I quote, "We are not and will not be a climate policy maker." However, in the Fed's draft principles on climate-related financial risks, one proposed principle suggested that boards of directors or of a financial institution should consider making changes to its compensation policies to align with values in the context of supposed climate risks. It appears then that the Federal Reserve, through regulation, wants to begin implementing climate policies. So which is it? There seems to be a disconnect between your statements publicly and the rules that the board is putting forward for comment.
Well, I feel strongly that climate change is an important issue that needs to be addressed by elected people. It's about
ท้องไม่รู้ร้อนแต่ท้องกูร้อนขนาดนั้น
Congress, clearly. So we do have a narrow role, and that role will be around making sure that banks understand and can manage the risks that they're running, and that's going to be it. And I, as I said before, there's we don't want to drift into becoming a climate policymaker, and we'll have to guard that border very carefully.
Regarding the Fed's climate scenario analysis pilot program, did the board vote to approve the creation of that pilot program?
มึงดูทองลงเรื่อยๆ
But I don't think so. I think it was already authorized.
And this is a concern that I have. I'm concerned that one governor acting unilaterally to implement major policy changes without board consensus is a problem. And so I would urge you and your colleagues on the board to continue a consensus-oriented approach. And I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now go to the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, Mr. Himes of Connecticut, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Chairman Powell. Thank you for your careful conduct of monetary policy, independent of the many political desires that circulate in this building. Independent monetary policy is a bedrock of a solid economy. I want to reflect for a moment on another bedrock of the American economy, the full faith and credit of the United States government, which is now being put at risk by the Republican majority. My Republican friends know how very dangerous a game they are playing. They know that salary payments to our soldiers are at risk. They know that their irresponsibility will raise mortgage rates for new home buyers. But they say this is the only time we focus on spending
ด้วยด่วนจะมีข้อมูลสำคัญอยู่ที่นั่นนะครับบอกไว้เลยติดตามไว้และตั้ง notification ไว้ด้วย
on the deficit is when you are voting for the spending and the tax cuts that create the deficit. When you're voting for the Trump tax cuts, which add $2 trillion to the national debt, that's the moment. Consider whether you want to do that.
ใจเย็นๆเบาใจเย็นลูกใจเย็น
Stuff gets a little complicated.
ใจเย็น
really need to understand.
ค่อยๆพูดกัน
Congress sits down to a huge 10-course meal of tax cuts and spending, more defense spending, and expansion of this program and stimulus, all of which we vote for.
เข้าใจ
First course, second course, white wine, red wine, 4 servings of dessert. And then the bill comes and my Republicans say, whoa, look at this bill. This is irresponsible. Do we really want to pay this bill? That's not the moment for the consideration. The moment is when you're ordering 4 helpings of dessert. That's when you should be talking about it and taking responsibility for the choices that we make without putting the full faith and credit of the United States at risk.
คือเข้าใจคือกูเขาไม่เข้าใจมึงจะขึ้นทำไม
Democracy comes in.
เบา
Republican friends like to point the finger at this side of the aisle and blame us. Chairman, as you know, fully 1/4.
โอเค
25%. Of today's United States debt was accrued in the 4 years of the Trump administration. This country's been around for 246 years. And fully 1/4 of the United States debt was accrued under President Trump. By the way, speaking of hypocrisy, in the 4 years of President Trump, the
ดู
debt ceiling was
เจ๊ข้างหน้า
suspended 3
บอก
times. I didn't even notice.
มึงจะดัง
Now,
ไป
of
ทำ
course,
ไม
we have a different president.
กูอยู่ข้างหลังนี่กูตกใจแทนมึงอีก
Now, Mr. Chairman, I don't think I'm going to persuade the majority to act responsibly here. I actually think the markets will persuade them. And you'll recall, because we were watching this closely, September 29th, 2008, the Republican House of Representatives voted down the Great Recession Rescue Package. As the vote was going down in the House of Representatives, the equity market dropped 7%. $1.2 trillion lost in people's retirement accounts. Now, Congress sobered up. A couple days later, we passed the Rescue Act. So, Mr. Chairman, there is a question here, and the question is this. You and I both watch the markets pretty closely. Treasury tells us that on June 5th, that's just 3 months away, on June 5th, the Treasury runs out of money. So my question to you, Mr. Chairman, I know I'm asking you to be a little speculative here, but what should we watch for? What market signals could indicate that the markets are getting fed up with the manifest irresponsibility around this? Give us some things that we should be looking for.
And I'd love to, but I'm going to limit myself to what other Fed chairmen.
แป๊บนึงนะที่มึงสาธยายมาทั้งหมดเนี่ยคำถามคือเฟดรู้ไหมว่าคาดเดาสิ่งที่จะเกิดขึ้นที่เล็กน้อยที่นี่เนี่ยเราควรจับสัญญาณตลาดที่สามารถบ่งชี้ว่าตลาดกำลังเบื่อความไร้ความรับผิดชอบของสิ่งที่จะทำและควรที่จะมองหากับทางสหรัฐหรือกับทางเราได้ไหมแค่นี้คำถามมึงสาธยายมาเป็น2 ชั่วโมงมึงถามแค่นี้
Serious about hurting ourselves. Is it possible that we could see interest rates rise more because
แล้วมึงจะขึ้นไปทำไม
states' debt decide that we're actually a little risky? Is that possible?
I think that and many other things are possible.
แล้วถามไม่ได้เกี่ยวข้องอะไรกับเขาเลย
If we cross that line, we're going to find out.
ด่ามาเป็น2 ชั่วโมงด่าเยอะกว่ากูอีก
And I, you know, I don't like pressing you on these things, but you said this and many other things are possible. You want to elaborate on what might be in the category of many other things?
Rather not, actually.
Okay. I figured. All right. Thank you, Mr. Powell. Again, I really thank you for your really responsible conduct of monetary policy. And there's a reason that you are insulated from our political desires, and I very much appreciate that and yield back.
สุดท้ายตบหัวรูปหลังเขาบอกว่าโอเคผมชอบคุณจริงๆสำหรับการใช้มาตรการของmonetary policy ในการดำเนินการนโยบายทางการเงินที่มีความรับผิดชอบจริงและมีเหตุผลคุณถูกกีดกันจากทางด้านการเมืองและขอบคุณเบียร์ริ่งขอบคุณครับบ้องขึ้นซะเขากูตกใจเลยที่หมาย
My home state of Texas. The world's 7th largest insurance market, proving the success of this system. Now, the National Association for Insurance Supervisors Conference in November, there is the opportunity to have the U.S. state-based aggregation method become formally recognized as comparable or equivalent to the insurance capital standard. We should not be following the European model that has increased regulations and less competition, and we should prioritize
และแล้วก็ดอยอีก1,000
and less government involvement in pricing. So my question is, Chairman, can you highlight the benefits of the U.S. state-based
ผมจะพยายามหาข้อมูลของคนที่กำลังฟังนะครับหรือใช้คำว่า House ท่านอื่นๆแล้วผมจะทวิตเตรียมไว้นะทวิตไปส่งข้อมูลไปให้ว่ากูจะดอยหรือยัง
I can say this. I do think that our insurance regulatory system has proved itself appropriate and adequate and gotten the job done for a long time, and we don't need to be copying other countries or other regions' insurance regulatory system. I'm a little rusty on the details of the capital requirements, but that sounds right.
But our bottom line is our side works, the other doesn't. We need to stay where we are.
Our side works.
Yeah, thank you. Also, in the past, you stated that banks were well capitalized. We've talked about that today, but now there have been increased conversations about raising capital requirements. Numerous economic studies have found that raising capital requirements for banks will increase borrowing costs for their consumer and commercial customers. And I'm somebody that's owned 50 years. I've never had a day I wasn't out of debt, so I'm concerned about this. And implementing additional regulatory capital requirements will slow economic growth and limit financial institutions' lending ability. So do you believe that raising capital requirements would raise the cost of borrowing and add cost to our economy in Main Street America?
Well, it depends on which banks experience higher capital requirements, and there isn't any proposal to evaluate right now, of course. But it's always a trade-off. Higher capital is good in a sense because it keeps banks able to lend during bad times. That's really a good thing. Too much capital, though, probably limits credit availability. So we're trying to strike that balance always.
วันนี้วันที่
This has been touched on a little today, but let me come from a different angle on it. But the Reserve was created to act as a nonpartisan entity that remains separate from party politics. Talks about that. And unfortunately, throughout recent years, the Fed has gotten caught up in politically charged issues like economic inequality, gender and race discrimination, and climate change. Recently, the Federal Reserve Board proposed guidance on managing climate-related risks for large banks, further proving that the Fed is giving in to some political pressure and operating outside its intended purpose and responsibilities. So our country's financial leaders, in my mind, should be focusing on addressing runaway inflation instead of worrying about the financial institutions doing to monitor change. So, and we touched on this a little bit, but how can the Fed ensure that they're not placing undue regulations and guidance on banks by forcing involvement in partisan green
ในชีวิต
politics?
กับอารมณ์ในไลฟ์ทำไมต่างกันครับ
They remain separate from
ป
political.
กติบ้างก็มีบ้าง2บุคลิก
It's absolutely critical that we do. I mean, our independence is part
ก็น่าจะไม่มีอะไรมากมั้งตอนนี้
stay out of stuff that you have not assigned us to do. And if we're going to wander all over it,
อย่าลืมติดตาม Twitter นะครับข้อมูลสำคัญจะทวิตไปเรื่อยๆแล้วก็กลุ่มไลน์นะครับเข้าไปด้วยกลุ่มทองคำนะครับส่วนวันนี้เท่าที่สังเกตเห็นไม่ได้มีคำถามที่จี้ใจดำนะครับมีจี้ใจดำตอนคำถาม1ถึงประมาณคำถามที่2แล้วมาจี้ใจดำคำถามเมื่อกี้อีกรอบนึงก็เห็นได้ชัดเลยว่าลุงยังไม่ปริปากถึงเรื่องการคงอัตราดอกเบี้ยและการชะลอของการขึ้นอัตราดอกเบี้ยนะครับแต่ดูเหมือนว่าจะยังคงมีมุมมองที่ซอฟต์กว่าเมื่อวานแต่ไม่ได้เยอะมากก็ส่งสัญญาณฮอกอยู่เหมือนเดิมนะครับพร้อมที่จะมีการขึ้นเมื่อกี้ถ้าเป็นคำตอบเมื่อกี้เลยนะครับก็คือเขาเตรียมเขียนบทใหม่ของการคาดการณ์ของการขึ้นอัตราดอกเบี้ยในวันที่22มีนาคมเรียบร้อยแล้วครับ
in many other countries, the central bank is out
เรียบร้อยแล้วครับ
with the support of the public doing.
ฉะนั้นในวันที่22มีนาบอกเลยว่าเป็นการคาดการณ์บทใหม่ที่อาจจะทำให้ไม่เหวก็ดอย
Thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
นะครับไม่เหวก็ดอย
We'll now go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you for holding this hearing. Chairman Powell, a pleasure to see you again. I've said it before and I'll say it again. It's always great to see you because I always think of the old Republicans, the ones who are very noble, did the right thing, didn't play chicken with the economy, very forthright. And so anyway, I appreciate you being here very much. Like some of my colleagues on the other side, I'd say the same thing about some. And I appreciate you. So we heard today that the inflation is Biden's fault. So what is the inflation rate in the European Union today?
It's high.
It's high. Is it 10% possibly?
I think if you're talking about headline, I don't have this figure in my head, but it's very, very high from a headline standpoint. And they've had core inflation move up too.
So are they following Biden's then policies? Is that what caused the inflation? Because it seems to be Biden's fault.
มีความเป็นไปได้ไหม 10%
So I think inflation is everywhere, and it must have to do with common factor, and that common factor has to be the reopening of the economy after and the things that were done on COVID. On the other hand, each country has a little bit different case, and I think you have to be careful. We had much more of a demand-oriented issue than they did. Now they
อย่าลืมนะครับที่นนทบุรีเจอกันในวัน
looks a lot like ours did a year ago.
ในวันที่
Yeah, I just had to bring it up because again, Sherman brought it up, but it's interesting every time I hear inflation is
นนทบุรีเจอกันนะครับสามารถ
I wonder why is it all over the world.
สามารถลงทะเบียนได้นะครับที่หน้าเพจแล้วมีคำว่าแนะนำนะนนทบุรีเจอกันนะครับก็วันที่11นี้นะสงสัยดอยแล้วครับแล้วก็วันที่30มีนา31มีนาเจอกันที่ไอบิดนะครับลงทะเบียนได้นะตามเงื่อนไขที่แจ้งไว้นะครับแต่ส่วนของนนทบุรีนี่คือฟรีแต่ส่วนของเอ็กซ์คลูซีฟก็ฟรีเหมือนกันนะครับแต่ก็คือตามเงื่อนไขเล็กน้อยเดี๋ยวจะมีลำปางและโคราชนะครับ ส่วนวันพรุ่งนี้ก็เจอกันที่
got the bankers up here during
ที่ไหน
the
วะ
stress
ที่
test.
พาราโซนะครับของคุณโซอี้
And we asked them as
นะครับ
help
มันมะรืนโทษมะรืน
you know what they said?
มะรืน
You know what they said? No, they said it was help. In fact, it kept
74 อยู่
the banks capitalized. It was fascinating.
นครพนมยังครับตอน
Fair
นี้
to them, they did complain about some of the smaller issues, but not Dodd-Frank in general, the bill. Then it seemed that CFPB
นครสวรรค์น่าจะไปในปลายเมษาครับนครสวรรค์
seemed to fade on that. I think the reason for that is the CFPB has actually helped so many people, and now a lot of their own constituents now are getting helped by the CFPB. So all of a sudden, there's not quite the energy. So now they're attacking ESG.
ปวดอะไรวะเนี่ย
ESG, and they're saying that you and everybody else is somehow conspiring to make sure they don't buy their oil or their coal. Are you conspiring to do that? Are you conspiring?
I don't believe we're conspiring.
Now, I heard it was supposed climate risk. Is there risk in the climate change?
เอาอย่าปัญหาเรื่อง climate change อีก
Would
อ่ะ
it affect the bank?
Certainly, in the longer run, yes.
Of course it can. Do you think insurance companies take this into
แอคล็อกคืออะไร
Yes, actually, I believe they do.
They absolutely do.
Egg lockคืออะไรครับ
Long duration liabilities, they certainly do.
Of course they do. I mean, they're very concerned with it. Weather is a big deal. I was a vice president of Liberty Mutual, their corporate legal department, and I can tell you weather and the changing of the weather. We used to have what we call catastrophes. And these catastrophes happen every 25, 50, 100 years. Now those 25, 50, and 100-year events happen every 5 years, every 2 years. So of course it is. I mean, it's ridiculous not to take a look at these ESG factors. We have to. And again, I'm glad that you guys are taking a look at it because it's real. I'm glad that, you know, the president's taking a look at it. And it's sad that my colleagues on the other side just want to stick their head in the sand and say,
หายใจ
no,
เดี๋ยวขอ
climate
ไปคุยกับ
change
ทีมงานก่อนนะครับ
proves that climate change.
เพราะว่าส่วนใหญ่แล้วจะเป็นอยากจะทำเหล่าบรรดาเพจสดลดชื่อเบื่อทวงมากกว่า
You don't believe it? Go ask all those poor people in Florida that had those huge hurricanes come through and wipe them out. So again, I appreciate very much the work that you've done. The only thing I hope is, as you said, if we ever see this pitch again, we'll know how to swing at it. And I hope we don't get the pitch of defaulting, because I'm not sure we'll know how to swing at that one. So thank you again. Thank you for being. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time, gentleman yields back. Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now go to the chair of the Oversight Subcommittee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Heisinger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to move quickly, and good to see you again, Chair.
ไม่แน่ครับนักหลักทีนี้อาจจะมา
I caught a little bit of the Senate hearings yesterday.
มาเขาคิดจะกุดมี
Got a lot of pressure
ที่ไหนครับ
to keep the sugar high going.
คิดจะกุ
And
ด
frankly, if the
คิด
Fed
จะกุด
and many of our colleagues had listened to what many of us were saying,
วันนี้น่าจะเป็นตัวอยู่แถวนี้ครับเพราะว่าเมื่อวานซัดไปหนักละ ไม่มีอะไรเปลี่ยนแปลง
and frankly, we wouldn't be in this position. To reference Chair Greenspan's punch bowl analogy, not only did no one have the courage to remove the punch bowl, you had
จะมีทวิตเรื่องคริปโตด้วยนะครับ
bottle of
เล็กน้อย
151 rum into the punch bowl.
ก็ตามอยู่
And
ฝั่ง
here
ของ
you
คริ
got
ปโต
folks wanting to do the exact same thing. Let's spend more.
แต่ก็ไม่ได้ตามมาก
It's just, and
ส่วนใหญ่จะเน้น
you
บร
have
รดา
the
การวางกลยุทธ์ซะมากกว่าครับ
to slow the economy or let
พิษโลก
everyone
เพ
get
ชรบูรณ์
crushed by
พิษโลกเคยไปแล้วครับ
And
เพชรบูรณ์ไม่แน่
tightening means a slower economy. Slower economy means fewer jobs. Fewer jobs hit those
วัน
who
พรุ่งนี้จะมี
least
ผู้ยื่นขอรับสวัสดิการการว่างงานครั้งแรกต่อเนื่อง4 สัปดาห์
the lower rungs of the economic ladder suffer more than the rest of the ladder. So that's the state. That's the state of play where we're at. I have to hit a couple of quick issues here. I wanted to start off by discussing climate, especially given the Fed's announcement in January that it was going to conduct a pilot climate scenario analysis exercise.
อาจารย์ไปคมนาคมครับไม่แล้ว
have each issued proposed climate risk management principles for banks that you are attempting to
ยิ้มหน่อย
finalize
ครับอาจารย์
by the
มัน
end
ติ
of
ด
the
ดอย
year.
ยิ้มไง
The
นะ
requirements don't stop at the border. The UK
ไอ้พูดถึง
and
เนี่ย
EU central banks
ไอ้พูดถึงในฝั่งของใครไม่เชียร์เนี่ย
disclosure regimes as well. I know the Fed is taking
นอนฟาร์มไม่ใช่พรุ่งนี้มะรืน
charges in the holistic
วันนี้ออกมา 240,000 เดี๋ยวถ้าใครอยากฟังนอนฟาร์มพิมพ์ตัว N มานะครับ เพราะวันนี้ออกมา 240,000 คาดการณ์ 200,000 แต่ครั้งก่อนคาดการณ์ 200,000
So I want to ask you a
ประมาณ
very
240,000 ครับ
question. Will you
ครั้งก่อน
commit that you will withhold
160,000 กับ 6,000
for a new capital rule that increases capital charges on bank activities in traditional energy
เมื่อ
companies?
เช้าเห็นอะไรบางอย่าง
I can't sit here and promise what I will not.
ทำไมดอลลาร์อ่อนค่าเมื่อเช้าที่ผ่านมาในช่วงประมาณ 2:15
I'm sorry, it's
What,
not a
Lemonade?
thing.
This isn't about, this is about overall capital more than a specific thing you're talking about.
Okay. We're going to follow up on that because we need to have a real-time conversation about what that is going on there. I want to quickly switch topics and go in a different direction for this next question. I want to ask you about two opinions issued by your legal staff in November of 2019 and December of 2020 to the asset managers Vanguard and BlackRock. Mr. Chairman McHenry, I'd like to submit the two letters for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. These opinions appear to be to outline the parameters of both how both Vanguard and BlackRock can operate without being deemed a holding company. In addition to the legal restrictions outlined by the Bank, these opinions listed out here in great detail list out commitments that the companies would need to take to avoid being viewed as having control. These opinions also provide assurances that the Federal Reserve Board staff would not recommend that the board find asset managers to be holding companies. Further, it is unclear whether the board will take any steps beyond self-certification by the asset managers to monitor compliance with the condition that they, quote, not take any action to control a banking organization. As some asset managers play a larger role and clearly strive to influence policy in companies across the free market, we need to remain vigilant. So, Chair Powell, is the board taking any steps to assess or monitor whether Vanguard and BlackRock are complying with the commitments made in November of 2019 and December of 2020, respectively?
I would have to check and get back to you on that.
Okay. I appreciate that. But that says to me that
ไม่ใช่แผนของผมหมายถึงว่าในฝั่งของเฟดครับเขาปรับแผนละ
or scrutiny of that, is somebody reviewing that or is someone in charge of reviewing that?
ตลาดหุ้นดีตัวเว้ยเฮ้ย
Honestly,
ทองคำไม่ดีตัวเหรอ
narrow question.
เกิดอะไรขึ้นเดี๋ยวขอดูก่อน
Well, it's specific and narrow to two companies, but not to an industry. I mean, that's what we need to be driving at. And I guess we need to find out whether there's somebody proactively reviewing these activities and these
ตอนนี้ใน
commitments.
ฝั่งของนักลงทุนคาดการณ์อัตราดอกเบี้ยขึ้นไปที่ 6% นะครับ
So, how often do you think they should be reassessed? Annually, monthly, biannually?
You know, this is a
แล้วก็
very narrow set of questions. I can
มีบางสำนักเขาบอกว่า
I look forward to those great answers, and I yield.
We'll now go to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr.
มันเป็นเพียงการยืนยัน
Thank you,
ใน
Mr.
การกำหนด
Chairman,
ราคา
for joining us today. Chairman Powell, when you testified before
ซึ่งการซื้อขายออปชั่นในฝั่งของอัตราดอกเบี้ยอยู่ที่ 6% ภายในเดือนกันยายนกำลังมีการพนันกัน
decreased to 5.4%. We're moving in the right
คือในฝั่งของตลาดผมเรียกว่าตลาดซื้อขายฟิวเจอร์ครับเขามีการเบสกันอยู่ที่ 6%
the Federal Reserve is targeting. Do you believe 2% is still the right target for inflation? And given the ongoing energy transition, the push to shift supply chains out of China, and the labor shortage here in the U.S., should the Fed consider adjusting its target to avoid overly burdening Americans? Would a decline to 3% inflation be enough to offer price?
ตีหนึ่งประมูลพันธบัตร10 ปีสำคัญมากครับ
No, 2% inflation is going to remain our longer-term inflation.
สำคัญมาก
Are you concerned given all the other factors that I mentioned, or do you think we just have to keep sticking with that?
I think that's got to remain our longer-term inflation goal. It's the global standard, and it's our standard, and this is not a time in which we
6% เหรอ
start talking about changing it. We have no instinct to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The gig economy has grown significantly in recent years as more Americans are working as contractors
วันนี้ไปหา
or running small businesses. The Dallas
วันนี้พยายามไปหาในฝั่งของ core service inflation นะครับหรือใช้คำว่า core service ที่เฟดเขาได้ดูก็คือ core service ex housing กำลังหาอยู่และกำลังไปหากราฟตรงนั้นอยู่นะครับถ้าเดี๋ยวมีข้อมูลสำคัญแล้วเดี๋ยวจะมาแบ่งปันกันครับเพราะว่าเฟดเขาใช้ตัวเลขนี้เป็นตัวเลขชี้วัดจากเอกสารเมื่อวานที่ผ่านมาฉะนั้นก็วันนี้ถ้าไม่มีอะไรเกิดขึ้นตัวเลขไอ้กราฟต่างๆก็จะเหวี่ยงอยู่ข้างๆเพราะว่าฝั่งของการถามตอบเนี่ย จะไม่ได้เข้าสู่คล้ายๆกับฝั่งของการคาดการเศรษฐกิจละนะครับก็ออกแนวในการทำงานเหมือนคุณพอว่านะครับออกแนวในการทำงานของเขาเองนะครับเพื่อให้เป็นประโยชน์ของเขาเองในฝั่งของการทำงานนะครับฉะนั้นวันนี้อาจจะไม่ค่อยมีอะไรมากแต่ปัญหาคือในเมื่อในผมเชื่อว่าในส่วนของเมื่อเช้าที่ผ่านมาครับทางฝั่งของอัตราการจ้างงานนอกภาคการเกษตรของ ADP ประกาศออกมาใช้คำว่าไม่เหนือจากการคาดการมากนักไม่เหนือจากการคาดการมากนักผมจะให้ดูนะคือมันจะเป็นเอกสารฉบับนี้ครับใครอยากฟังกด0ครับสิ่งที่เซอร์ไพรส์เล็กๆที่ทำให้ฝั่งของดอลลาร์อ่อนค่าเล็กๆมันมีอยู่อันหนึ่งครับมันมีอยู่อันหนึ่งสิ่งที่ทำให้เกิดนะผมจะให้ทำให้เกิดเหตุการณ์ก็คือมีอยู่อันหนึ่งใช่ไหมอันหนึ่งก็คือสิ่งที่ทำให้ดอลลาร์อ่อนค่านะใช้คำว่าสิ่งที่ทำให้ทองดีดตัวขึ้นนะในฝั่งของการประกาศตัวเลขนอนฟาร์ม ADP นะครับติดดอยไปเรื่อยแล้วเดี๋ยวผมขออนุญาตเตรียมตัวจะคัดลอตที่ผมอาจจะคัดลอตที่คัดไป2 วันแล้วนี่ไม่น่าสวนกับเขาเลยขอคัดลอตที่ถ้าเป็น M15 แล้วลองใช้
building on that a little bit, what's the right metric you think for if you're in our shoes for assessing our fiscal health? Do you think we should be focused on maintaining a specific debt to GDP ratio, or is there?
ผมอาจจะคัดลอตโซนนี้ครับ1816คงไม่ถึงข้างล่างหรอกข้างล่างลึกๆไป1816กว่า1815ผมจะคัดลอตโซนนี้อันนี้คือแค่วัดแบบไม่คิดอะไรนะวัดแบบคิดอะไรนะเพราะว่ามีคำเดียวที่เฟดยังคงตราตรึงก็คืออัตราเงินเฟ้อ 2%นี่สิ่งที่ทำให้ดอลลาร์อ่อนค่านะครับแล้วทองคำขึ้นเล็กน้อยในช่วงของการประกาศในเวลาดังกล่าวก็คือ20:15เดี๋ยวผมให้ไปดูนะครับเราก็ต้องเวลาที่ไปวัดเนี่ยผมก็ต้องไปวัดที่ในเมืองก็ได้นะครับหรือไม่ไปวัดที่ไกลๆที่เขาศรัทธากันถูกไหมถ้าเวลาไปวัดนะครับได้ไหมได้นะก็แอบเล่นนิดนึงนะเพื่อที่จะไปจิบอะไรก็ว่าไปนะเล็กน้อยถึงปานกลางได้อยู่นะหากริบไปเลยทีเดียวเสียงแอร์นี่ดังเหลือเกินนะได้อยู่ประมาณว่าเสียงแอร์กูดังมากประมาณนั้นให้เล่นกันบ้างนะเงียบกันมานานแล้วไงเหมือนกันเขาเรียกว่าตามสะดวกครับกูสะดวกแบบนี้โอ้ยไปเรื่อยเลยกูเราไปดูครับสิ่งที่ทำให้ฝั่งของทองเขาเด้งก็คือในช่วงเวลา 22 นาฬิกานะครับแต่เราไปดูตอนสตาร์ทครับ20:15เนาะอันนี้ทำเฟรม1 นาทีนะครับประมาณ20:15เนี่ยป้งมาเนี่ย15ป้งเนี่ยคือดีดตัวขึ้นก่อนนะครับดีดตัวขึ้นก่อนสังเกตเห็นไหมดีดตัวขึ้นเสร็จปุ๊บพอตลาดเซ็ตตัวแล้วเข้าไปอ่านข้อมูลเชิงลึกที่ผมนั่งอ่านดูก็คือมีการเซอร์ไพรส์ตรงอย่างหนึ่งอะคือนี่ครับในส่วนของการใช้จ่ายการเติบโตของการใช้จ่าย pay growth slow นี่ใช้คำว่าการเติบโตของการใช้จ่าย ชะลอตัวลงในเดือนกุมภาพันธ์ทำให้ตลาดตกกระจายเลยเฮ้ยมันเกิดจากอะไรซึ่งในสิ่งที่เขาบอกก็คือ pay growth for job stay slow to 7.2% ก็คือในฝั่งของการเติบโตค่าจ้างสำหรับผู้ที่ทำงานชะลอตัวเหลือ 7.2% ในเดือนกุมภาพันธ์นะครับซึ่งเป็นอัตราการเพิ่มขึ้นที่ช้าที่สุดในรอบ 12 เดือนนะครับการเติบโตของค่าจ้างสำหรับผู้ที่เปลี่ยนงานก็ลดลงเช่นเดียวกันซึ่งลดลงเหลือ 14.3 จาก 14.9 ทำให้ฝั่งของราคาทองคำและดอลลาร์ผันผวนซึ่งดอลลาร์อ่อนค่าเล็กน้อยทองยกตัวขึ้นเล็กน้อยเท่านั้นสังเกตเห็นการยกตัวของราคาทองในช็อตที่มีการประกาศนะครับก็สตาร์ทตุ้มพออ่านเสร็จหรืออะไรก็ตามพอ3 ทุ่มกับปาง3 ทุ่มครึ่งกับปางไปจนถึงเลยไปลอยไปรอประธานเฟดนะครับที่จะพูดออกมาให้เป็นแบบดิบๆดีๆและแล้วครับสิ่งที่ผมเองก็ยังคงตราตรึงว่า ADP มันจะเกี่ยวเนื่องไปถึงวันศุกร์ก็คือภาคเซอร์วิสครับทั้งหมดทั้งมวลมีการจ้างงานทั้งหมดอยู่ที่ 242,000 ตำแหน่งนะ 242,000 ตำแหน่งอันนี้เดี๋ยวพูดดีๆนะไม่ใช่ลองสังเกตดูดีนะครับ 242,000 ตำแหน่งทั้งหมดเลยนะครับโดยที่ฝั่งของการจ้างงานเพิ่มขึ้นนะครับซึ่งการเติบโตของค่าจ้างยังคงสูงขึ้นจุดอ่อนก็คือเกิดจากไม่ใช่จุดอ่อนเกิดขึ้นเฉพาะสถานประกอบการขนาดเล็กซึ่งเลิกจ้างงานทุกเดือนตั้งแต่เดือนสิงหาคมปี 2022 นะครับก็คือสถานประกอบการขนาดเล็กเท่านั้นเองแต่สิ่งที่ผมคิดว่าจะไปด้วยกันได้ไหมคือภาคเซอร์วิสครับมีการจ้างงานเยอะที่สุดอันเนี้ยเดี๋ยวผมขออนุญาตไปตีความก่อนแต่ถ้าตีความแบบบ้านๆเลยเนี่ยCore Service X Housing มันจะเกี่ยวข้องกับตรงนี้ไหมเฟดไม่ได้สนใจทางด้านเงินเฟ้อภาคสินค้าถ้าตามเอกสารเมื่อวานเฟดไม่ได้สนใจเรื่องเงินเฟ้อสินค้าหลักแต่เฟดสนใจ Core Service ที่ไม่รวมราคาบ้านและบังเอิญการจ้างงานในฝั่งเซอร์วิสเสือกสูงมันจะลิงก์กันได้ไหมฝั่งของ hospitality hospitality นะครับเยอะมากกว่าเพื่อนการจ้างงานตั้ง190,000 ตำแหน่งในภาคบริการครับนอนฟาร์มรอบนี้รู้เรื่องบอกไว้เลยรู้เรื่องฉะนั้นถ้าเป็นไปในทิศทางของลุงที่เห็นตัวเลขแล้ววันศุกร์อาจจะมีสิทธิ์ดอยต่อก็ได้ ใครเข้าใจกด2ครับ
In the chart you're looking at, this is chart 14.
ซึ่งข้อมูลทั้งหลายทั้งปวงถ้าเป็นไปในทิศทางที่เราคุยกันเมื่อวานจากฝั่งของเฟด
Median wages are up 5%, which is
ขาบายตายเรียบ
10-year period before. And yes, inflation is still a bit higher than that. What I'm wondering is you look at the economy, is wage growth universally bad in your view, or is wage growth good to the extent that it's keeping up with wages? Because historically wages didn't keep up. And how do you think through that nuance? Because interest rates are a very blunt tool.
ผมจะไปตีความอีกครั้งในวันพรุ่งนี้คือพวกเซอร์วิสคอเซอร์วิสเนี่ยเขาเอาตัวเลขไหนมาเป็นการคำนวณบ้าง
I'd say two things. First, we want wages to go up.
ยังไม่มีการสรุปอะไรเลยทั้งสิ้นครับ
Consistent over time with the increase of productivity.
แต่กูดอยไปละ
That makes all the sense. The other thing I would say is
กะว่าลุงจะงัดให้ก่อนแล้วผมมาตบเซลล์อีกครั้งคือกูบายไปตอนเช้าฉะนั้นใครจะ follow เซลล์ตรงนี้ได้เลยแต่ stop loss ปลายหัวตันแค่นี้ก็พอที่เหลือรันเทรนขาลงครับ
We're all opposed to inflation here, but
กูสื่อบายไป
in that 2010 to 2020 period,
บายตรงไหนรู้ไหม
is a very low inflationary.
นี่
Wages
2-3 เลยทีเดียว
did not float away. Wages
สุด
did not
ติ่ง
float
กระดิ่งแมว
We didn't think about that as a problem for the Fed to fix because
บายปลายเลยตอน2คำถามแรกเลยรู้เรื่อง
this gets sort of theoretical, but let's say that we had 6% wage inflation and 5% CPI. There'd be more money in people's pockets, but would we view that as a inflationary period to go down on? You know, because we didn't view the inverse as a problem.
So our job is to restore price stability and keep price stability. It isn't to keep wages down. It's certainly not to get involved in
ไบเดนกำลัง
the appropriate
พูด
labor share.
นะครับในส่วนของไบเดน
That's not the way we think about it at all. We think about price stability, and when we think about price stability, we think about wages as an important input to that. But we're not targeting a particular level of prices, and we would never say that we
ไม่ใช่ไบเดนกันพูด
wages.
งบประมาณของประธานาธิบดีโจไบเดนครับมีเป้าหมายอยู่ที่ประมาณ3 ล้าน
To do that, we have to think about wages. In particular, no one at the Fed would be upset to see the labor share go up, but that's not something that our policies affect.
โอ้
That's set by
ในระยะเวลา10 ปีเลย
globalization and maybe it's technology and educational skills and aptitude and all those things.
เพิ่งเข้าที่เห็นครับแตกไหมครับจานบายปลายไส้เลยถูกต้องครับ
labor share.
Yeah, and
จานคงหมดราคาบายแล้วใช่ไหม
it's hard to have these conversations in 5 minutes.
ถ้าเป็นไปตามข้อมูลนี้นะ ก็เริ่มตัดใจได้
What's hard is that, like, you know, also in that 2010 to 2020 period, median home prices went up by 50%. We didn't view that as inflationary. You know, 401ks went up a lot. We didn't view that as inflationary because those were asset increases. And so, as we have shifted the gains from people who had wealth to people who were dependent on wages.
แล้ววันนี้น่าจะแฝงตัวถูกอยู่แถวนี้แล้วถ้าไม่เกิดเหตุการณ์ที่เรียกว่าข่าวนอกตาราง
We'll now go to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, for 5 minutes.
Thank you for being with us today, Chairman Powell. Chair Powell, I just want to echo at the outset some of the concerns that my colleagues have raised about Vice Chair Michael Barr's, quote, holistic, unquote, holistic
22 อาจจะมีเซอร์ไพรส์ครับว่าทางฝั่งของการขึ้นดอกเบี้ยเนี่ย
as well as your decision
อาจจะไป 50 ไปเลย
in charge of the Community Reinvestment Act rulemaking.
ไม่ใช่วันนี้นะครับ SPDR ขายเมื่อวานครับ
Chair Powell, I was pleased to see
วันนี้ขายเพิ่มเหรอ ใครสนใจแดชบอร์ดติดต่อได้ที่ Line @Forex Monday นะครับหรือไปหน้าที่เว็บไซต์ Forex Monday ได้เลยเด้อเว็บไซต์ Forex Monday นะครับมีข่าวทั่วไปเพียบเพิ่มภาพโอ้ขายไปเมื่อวานแล้ววันนี้7แล้วขายไปเมื่อวานแล้วครับไม่ใช่วันนี้สนใจนะครับแดชบอร์ดตรงนี้
We know that the flow of coins, the natural flow of coins in the economy slowed down a lot because people were staying home and that kind of thing, and they may have switched to non-coin-based
เอาอย่างพูดถึงสกุลเงินดิจิตอลอีกแล้ว
and we feel like that evidence is that that's continued now. People are paying electronically and things like that, and coins are sitting in jars and on people's desks and at home.
บายโชว์หน่อยบายทำไมติดบายอยู่2 ไม้
And so we're working on that. We're working with the Mint. We're working with all the stakeholders in the coin ecosystem to try to address this problem, and we're well aware of it.
So it seems to me that what
Bank
we
of
learned
Canada
from that is that it's probably necessary to have a greater reserve if there is such an interruption in the future, so that
ดอยละดอยแน่ๆ
Congress is not indeed interrupted.
ถ้าทางดอยเต็ม
Would you share that broad view?
It sounds right. I'm not an expert. I will say it feels like we need more coins now because more of them are sitting in people's homes and pockets, and they're not flowing back to where retailers in particular need the flow of coins. So that sounds right to me.
On a related note, could you speak about the importance of maintaining
ติด
cash,
บายเมื่อวานครับราคาเดียวกันอาจารย์เลยแก้ไงดีเรา
particularly for those that lack or don't have access to traditional financial
เมื่อ
services?
วานก็บายนะคัดลอสด้วยนะวันนี้บายอีกคัดลอสอีก
There are people who don't have credit cards, and many people
น้ำตาจะไหล
have credit cards. They don't have
แล้วไหลลงหลักปักมาเนี่ยจาก 2-3 มา 1-5 แล้ว
stores are not
ไม่ไว้หน้ากูเลย
dealing with people who
พันธบัตรรัฐบาลก็ฟื้นตัวขึ้นแล้วนะครับ
problem for those people in the economy. We have it at the Board of Governors, and you see it elsewhere because most payments are now taken care of by credit cards, and it's very efficient. But we need to be looking out for people who use cash.
Thank you. I appreciate the perspective. Picking
พอ
up
เหอะ
on Mr.
พอเหอะลุง
Luke's concerns that he
ยิ่ง
expressed
ถามยิ่ง
earlier,
ต่อ
as
มัน
you know,
ยิ่ง
the Consumer Financial Protection
ยิ่งลง
Bureau's funding mechanism is intricately linked to the Federal Reserve System. According to Title 10 of Dodd-Frank, each
ยิ่ง
quarter
ถาม
the
ยิ่งต่อ
FTP
มันยิ่งลง
director requests an amount
ตอนแรกเนี่ยเหอะใส่ซะ
necessary to carry out the Bureau's authorities, and the Federal Reserve
เจ็บ
must
นี้
transfer that amount
อีก
so
นาน
long as it does not exceed
เจ็บนี้
12% of the Federal Reserve's
ไม่ลืม
operating expenses.
ฮ่า
For the first 5 years
เจ็บ
of
ลึก
existence of CFPB,
เพียงเคย
as a relaxation
เจ็บ
there,
ช้ำกว่าใคร
to that 12% cap,
ติดดอย
$200 million annually to be spent beyond that number so long as it was reported, so long as the reported excess
เงินรัสเซียระยะยาวซื้อเก็บได้ไหม
congressional
โอ้ยจะไปสปา
chairmanship has
จะไปสปา
rejected
อย่าทำไปเรื่อย
the CFPB
เอาที่มันแบบมีความน่าเชื่อถือหน่อย
And could you tell us what policies and procedures are in place at the Fed to ensure that there is no waste, fraud, or abuse, or that these limits are not otherwise exceeded?
เดี๋ยวเซลล์ปุ๊บเดี๋ยวมันขึ้น แล้วก็นิ่ง
We share a common inspector general.
กูก็คาอยู่ตรงเนี้ยเรียบร้อยพรุ่งนี้เดินทางอีกเอาที่สบายใจเลยกูยังไม่ได้เก็บอะไรเลยตอนนี้น้ำตาจะไหล
Thank you. I appreciate that insight. In closing, Chair Powell, yesterday Senator Warren
พอเหอะ
asked
ลูก
you what you would
พอเห
say
อะ
to
ลุง
the
พอเหอะ
2
พอเห
million
อะ
people who may lose their jobs if the Fed keeps raising interest rates.
นะ
Frankly,
คำถามดีๆทำไมถึงมาทีหลังทำไมถึงไม่เอาคำถามดีๆก่อนค
Same
รั้งแรก
question when she voted and
เข้าใจปะ
advocated for the Democrats' reckless spending packages that caused this inflation that we are seeing today, and is the reason the Fed has had to raise
น้ำมันถ้า
interest
หุ้นลง
rates.
น้ำมันลงต่อครับ
Frankly, I would call on Senator Warren, the President, and the Democratic Party, for that matter, to apologize to the American people
ถือว่าเอาอะไรมาใช้บ้าง
this kitchen table crisis across the country. With that, Chairman, I yield back.
Now recognize the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley.
โอ้โหตกใจ
Thank you, Chairman Powell, for joining us today and for your testimony. I'm going to focus my comments and my questions on the high costs that families in my district are seeing because of your interest rate hikes. Now, while the Fed has acknowledged that higher interest rates are not the primary driver for the slowdown in price increases, you continue to raise interest rates, risking not only millions of jobs, but also a recession. Based on projections from the Fed, approximately 2 million people will lose their jobs. So that's 2 million families who will struggle to put food on the
โอ้
table.
โหยิงคำถามดอกเบี้ยแล้วครับคุณผู้หญิง
But the economic hardship does not end
เอ
there.
อ
Mr. Chair, I would like to request unanimous consent to submit a recent paper by the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland
น่าจะมาจาก
titled
วากันดา
Post-COVID Inflation Dynamics into the record.
Without objection.
Chairman Powell, are you familiar with this publication? Yes or no?
No.
โอ้โหชูฮ้องลงอีกแล้ว
Well, let me give you some context. In this paper, the Fed's own economists predict that reaching the 2% inflation goal that you have set will be impossible without causing a recession and spiking the unemployment rate to 7.4%.
โอ้แต่ผมดูนะ
Which
ผมดูนะ
translates to millions of people
อะไรนะ
losing their jobs.
ของวากันดา
Chairman
เนี่ย
Powell,
ดู
many economists agree
แต่ละ
with
แต่ละคนนี่สวย
that
สวยสวย
engineering a recession
แข็ง
to
แกร่ง
bring
แข็งแกร่ง
inflation
แข็งแก
under
ร่งจริงอันนี้
control
จริงอันนี้จริง
is not
จริงจริง
the right
ไม่ได้มูลี่นะจริงจริงจริง
especially at a time when we are seeing inflation cool in real time
คนนำเสนอดีเลย
independent of your rate hikes.
ดีเลยดีเลย
So on behalf of the people of this country, to prevent a recession, yes or no, Chairman Powell, will you pause future interest rate hikes?
We're not seeking to have a recession, and we don't think we need to have a recession.
ไม่นะเขาน่าจะเป็นมะเร็งแล้วทำคีโม
Will
ผม
you
เรื่องป่ะครับ
pause interest
อาจ
rate
จะเป็น
hikes?
คือ
Yes
ส
or
มัย
no?
นี้นะผมเรียกว่าสมัยนี้นะตัดผมทรงไหนอะไรก็ตามเนี่ยมันไม่เกี่ยวข้องต้องเป็นมะเร็งหรอกครับเขาอาจจะ
Because I don't know.
ก็ดูดิดูไอ้หนังแต่ละภาพยนตร์แต่ละเรื่องสิเห็นไหม
Serious implications.
อย่าง
People who will bear the brunt of an
เรียกว่าอย่างอะไร
economic recession
อย่าง
are most vulnerable.
อย่าง
We know from
ผม
past
ใช้คำว่า
experiences that recessions have catastrophic and deeply inequitable
อย่างหนังบางเรื่อง
consequences.
เนี่ย
In fact, while some will catch
สมัยนี้แล้ว
cold,
จริง
others will catch pneumonia.
ๆ สมัยนี้แล้วสมัยนี้แล้ว
An economic cold.
ไม่ได้มูลี่บ้าไม่ได้มูลี่เลยไม่ได้มูลี่เลยนะ เพราะว่าสังเกตดูหนังแต่ละเรื่องที่ผมดูโอ้โหทรงผมไม่เกี่ยงเลย จริง
Is
ๆผม
done.
ไม่ได้เก่งที่ทรงผมหรอกครับ
To
แหม่
conclude,
คนเรา
we understand that our actions affect communities
ใช่ถ้า
and
แพนเทอร์ถูกต้อง
businesses across the
เอ
country.
อ
Could you elaborate? What is this effect to communities, families, and businesses? These interest rate hikes.
Well, right now we're trying to bring down inflation on behalf of all those families. I think high inflation is hurting, particularly working families all around the country, very badly. And as you know, if you're on a very limited budget and you don't have a lot of excess earnings, when prices start going up, you're in trouble right away. People, middle and upper middle class people have more resources. So we think it's absolutely critical for the working people in this country that we get inflation back under control. And also, while we're at it, we have a dual mandate.
Apologies, Mr. Chair. I'm just reclaiming my time here. Here's the thing. The most devastating impacts will be to our most vulnerable. Veterans to our most vulnerable. Veterans, the elderly, low-income workers, Black and brown workers, those who have often ignored and been neglected in the name of what you refer to as appropriate monetary policy. And yet, you assert that you will stay the course. It's unconscionable. And our most vulnerable workers and families cannot afford to wait for you to realize the harm that you are doing. In my opinion, this sounds more like the assertions of a greedy corporation than someone who has a public mission on behalf of the people of this country. So, one more question with my remaining time here. Chairman Powell, another consequence of your interest rate hikes has been the increase of the average 30-year mortgage rate to 6.6%, double of what it was 2 years ago. Do you see this widening inequity in the housing market as a problem? And what steps will you take to make housing more affordable? This is putting home ownership further and further out of reach for my constituents and parents, millennials, people of color, contributing to inequities and the racial wealth gap. So what are your thoughts on that?
Like our policies do.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chairs can submit for the record or answer.
I'll briefly say that if I can, that our interest rate policies affect interest-sensitive spending very directly. When we cut rates, they help housing. When we raise rates, you see the effect on housing. So.
Thank you.
The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
น่าจะไม่ชอบคุณลุงเจโรมพาเวลอ่ะ
We currently have $32 trillion in debt. Debt to GDP ratio is 120%, the highest it's ever been. And yes, we have a debt ceiling fight brewing for this summer.
I would argue it's an opportunity to get fiscal house.
ไม่ได้เกี่ยวกับทรงผมเลยจริง
There's no meaningful bipartisan effort to responsibly address our debt.
มิสเตอร์ทิมมอนก็
It even
เห็นป่ะ
political attacks, alleging Congress to cut Social Security and healthcare.
เฮ้ยอย่าไปมูลี่เขาบ้าเหรอดูดเวนจอห์นสันนั่นเป็นไงดเวนจอห์นสันไงล่ะ
And our healthcare system is fundamentally broken. We spend twice as much as the average country per person, and our obesity rate is 3 times the average.
ดูในฝั่งของ
I'm not advocating cuts.
ใครอะวินดีเซลอะเป็นไงล่ะ
And we must change.
อย่ามูลี่กันเรื่องบางเรื่อง
Briefly, let's go over some history. Social Security was created in 1937. The retirement age then was 65, and average life expectancy was 60. Easy to see how that math works. In 1960, Congress raised the retirement age to 67. It has not been increased since then. That year, life expectancy was 69. That math still works due to a growing population, but it's getting narrower. I will throw in another few statistics for that year, 1960. 14% of Americans were obese, and our debt to GDP ratio was 53%. Let's fast forward to this year. Our retirement age is still 67, but our life expectancy is 77. That math clearly does not work, nor is the program functioning the purpose for which it was designed. And shockingly, our obesity rate is 37%, and we spend $13,000 per person on healthcare compared to the global average of $6,000 per person and 13% obesity rate. Clearly, our healthcare system is failing. Our system focuses on managing sickness, where we should be facilitating health and wellness.
พูดถึงอัตรา
We will only meaningfully be able to address the debt ceiling by focusing on the biggest drivers of our debt.
พูดถึงอัตราเขาเรียกว่าอะไรนะ
should be focused on saving Social Security
สุขภาพ
and transforming our health
พูดถึงสุขภาพ
to
แล้ว
facilitate a healthy citizenry capable of working
พูดถึง
and
สุขภาพ
being
แล้ว
thriving members of society. The American people deserve more than the political nonsense.
ดูคนข้างหลังก็บอกว่า
5 years
กู
ago,
จะ
the
ฟัง
number one
เงิ
issue
น
in our
เฟ้อ
debt. It has been and continues
มา
to be our
พูด
greatest
ถึง
issue.
สุขภาพอีกละ
I hate to say it, but the last 4 years,
ดู
it's
ว่า
gotten
จะ
way
ไป
worse.
ยังไงต่อวะเนี่ย
Congress has spent $7 trillion.
ดูเขาเหลตา
$5 trillion was done mostly on party lines. The Democratic
ถาม
Party
ให้มันตรงหน่อยได้ไหม
have over the last 4
หมาย
years,
ถึง
but
กูนี่แหละ
the fiscal
เหลตาให้มึงถามให้มันตรงคำถามหน่อยเฮ้ย
inflation, which caused you
ท
to
อง
raise
ก็ลง
interest
เอา
rates.
เนี่ย
Last year, I asked you if you ever took into consideration the impact of interest rate increases on the cost of our debt service. You appropriately and adamantly said no. Our debt service cost the next 10 years will be over $10 trillion. I'm going to point out 2 things. Number one, that is more than all of our debt service since 1940 combined. The
น่า
last
จะติดบายนะครับคนข้างหลัง
And while you
ป
did
ระมาณ
not
ว่า
take interest rate increases
เวลาถามอะไรมึงเจาะตรงประเด็นหน่อย
on
นะ
our debt service into your
ไม่ได้ติด
decision,
บายกัน
the best
กูด้วย
estimate is that
คนหนึ่ง
those rate increases will increase our debt service cost by $2 trillion in the next 10 years. So basically, the $7 trillion that that Democrats spent the last 4 years is going to cost us an additional $2 trillion. And that's not factoring in future rate increases as you continue to appropriately try to get inflation under control. As you can tell, this is a huge problem.
นิ่งมากข้างหลังอะ
$7 trillion unnecessary.
นิ่งเหลือเกินแล้วสายตาเนี่ยจะกรอกอย่าง
My colleagues across the aisle disagree with that causal relationship. Clinton's Treasury Secretary and Obama's Director of National Economic Council
เหมือนคิดอะไรบางอย่างป่ะ
wrote an op-ed before they spent the money and said it was going to cause inflation. And he has gone on the I was right tour for the last couple of years. We need responsible policymakers to address our debt. Let's talk about what's not serious. That's minting $1 trillion. Many of my colleagues across the aisle have advocated for this. Luckily, both President Biden and Secretary Yellen have said that this is not a serious proposal.
แกน่าจะดอยอยู่นะคนข้างหลัง
Unfortunately, the Biden administration
เปล่าหรอก
has a bit of a
หาเพื่อน
history of doing a 180 when the political winds blow. Most recently, he said he would veto the DC crime bill, and now he's adamantly supporting it and plans to sign it. So, dear pal, my only question of you is if Biden and Yellen send you $1 trillion coin, will you accept it?
And what I will say to that is
เอาอย่าง สาธยายมาเต็มที่
Congress raising the debt ceiling.
So you will not accept $1 trillion
ถาม
coin
อะไรไม่ได้เรื่องอีกแล้ว
if it's sent to you.
คนข้างหลังก็บอกว่า
No rabbits.
มึงหยุดได้ละ
Only
I know you don't like yes or no's, but if
หยุดได้ละ
you were sent $1 trillion coin and asked to treat it as $1 trillion, will you treat it as $1 trillion?
หยุดได้ละ
that would be a rabbit.
ไม่หรอกกูจะกลับละหยุดได้ละ
I'll take that as a no. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
ใช้ iPad ด้วย
Gentleman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chair Powell, for being here. You have a lot of economic, projections economic projections, various data.
พูดถึง economic projection อีกแล้ว
Reports that are coming out. How much, and you've studied inflation, right? I mean, obviously, it's your number one priority right now. How much is inflation impacted by these three things? Corporate profiteering, egregious executive pay, and the use of stock buybacks.
So I don't have numbers, but I would say in the case of executive pay and in the case of share repurchase,
เงินเฟ้อส่งผลกระทบ3สิ่งการแสวงหาผลประโยชน์ขององค์กรหรือผู้บริหารค่าจ้างและผู้บริหารเนี่ยคือการซื้อหุ้นคืน
in terms of profits, though,
มีผลกระทบไหม
profits are high. The places where profits are really high is places
จะไม่ได้เกี่ยวอะไร
where shortages and supply chain issues. And as those things get better, as they are, you're going to see inflation come down and even prices come down, and you'll see corporate margins come down.
ชื่ออะไร Miss
Part of how inflation.
Turby อ่ะ Turby
does that corporate profiteering does impact inflation? You don't have any stats percentage-wise how much of it, because you seem, I really paid attention to your testimony in the Senate hearing yesterday, and there was a lot of conversation about, my neighbors and residents' wages and so forth.
เขาให้ความสำคัญเขาเห็น
they're finally starting to
การให้การนั้นมีความสนใจที่ให้การเมื่อวานนี้
wages. It's not even far enough. I don't know if the Feds is paying closer attention to monopolies, corporate profiteering, and executive egregious pay. All of it, even the stock buybacks, you're saying all of that aside, you're focused more on wages and increasing the interest rate than on those other.
Our focus is really on price stability, not so much wages. Wages play into that because they're an important cost for business, but they're not. We're not trying to achieve a particular level of wages. We're trying to achieve 2% inflation.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, Chairman, what we saw during the pandemic is, the wealthy and the corporations continue to profit in large scale and still do buybacks and still do really egregious executive pay and benefits and so forth for those at the top.
แหมฟ้องจังเลยป้าผมบอลเขาเลยว่าสงสัยติดดอยมากเลยอะไรอย่างนี้คัดแล้วใช่ป่ะ
But what I hear
ฟ้องอย่างเดียวฟ้องอย่างเดียวพวกมึงฟ้องอย่างเดียวอะ
all of a sudden wages are skyrocketing, all this. But all I see is continuation again of those that are already getting a huge benefit, the folks at the top, the executives and so forth. My friend Glenn taught me this today, that the Feds are actually sitting on, something in Dodd-Frank section 956. You all are sitting on the last 12 years on guidance regarding executive compensation and the high risks of it, like around, there was some sort of proposal done, not implemented. Again, it's been 12 years. Why is that something that you're not concerned about regarding inflation?
ปรับพอร์ตแล้วนะฮะ
Like you guys
ลอง
are
ดู
sitting
ป
one
ฏิ
year
กิริยาใน
figure,
การปรับพอร์ต
right?
ของคุณป้าข้างหลังนะฮะ
It's been 12 years. And then two, why is that you're saying that's not big deal? That's not going to impact the cost
ผมว่าป้าเขาบายมา
of products and so
เพราะ
forth.
ทองกำลังขึ้น
It's a multi-agency rule, and there have been repeated attempts to get 5 or 6 or 7, however many it is, agencies to agree. That's one thing.
On disclosures?
No, this is on.
เอาแล้วก้มหน้าก้มตากันแล้วครับ
Yeah, which include
น่า
disclosures
จะกด
and
บายกันแล้วครับตอนนี้
regarding executive pay.
เราบายกันไหมแหม
Anyway,
สักขนาดนั้นเลย
You're right. We haven't been able to get.
ไม้ที่2ป้าจะกดแล้วนะครับสังเกตดูเคร่งเครียดกันเลยทีเดียว
Their boards long since. This is just for the big banks.
เคร่งเครียดกันเลยทีเดียวหมายถึงกูเนี่ยเครียด
Board of directors are preparing
หัวหน้าสั่นหมดเลย
on how executive compensation works and that it not reward, unnecessarily risky behavior.
Yeah, but in Dodd-Frank, which Congress passed, there should, you're supposed to put something in place, and it's not in place. And look, I'm saying this because so many people in this chamber, and I feel like the Feds are more obsessed with wages than they are in regards to the monopolies, the corporate profiteering. There hasn't been any. I mean, really, I don't think there is a laser focus on that, and it's really, because I think the Feds and Congress can support fair wages and still combat inflation if you are fair in combating egregious executive pay, monopolies, and corporate profiteering.
We don't do competition policy, and we also don't, broadly speaking, regulate corporate wages.
But
Till the
956
time
would have
expires.
addressed it.
Till the-
956 addresses it. You should have it's 12
The
years.
gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. Appreciate you coming in. I don't have to tell you the fact that housing, so goes the economy. I'm from a state that, from South Carolina, we have people moving in, the population's increasing. And I can tell you housing, not just single family housing, is in trouble. People are finishing what's in the pipeline. It's now affected multifamily apartments, the high rents that they did get with inflation. That's entirely caused, for the most part, by the policies of this administration with gas, buying it from other countries, with supply chain shortages. There's no reason to start a project when you can't get supplies. And that's what we're facing in the housing industry at all levels. So any increase in interest is just another dagger that's going to kill the housing industry, along with commercial projects that, again, the pipeline's filling up, but the pipeline, once it leaves, you're not going to have any. And I'm from a state that's with people moving in. One of the things that you hear, I think Mr. Davidson mentioned, was regulations. Banks are complaining about being overregulated and the costs associated with it. CRA, I know when Brainerd left, it's in a state of flux. Who's determining that, and when will you have some guidelines out?
That'll be done by the whole board of governors when we vote on it, and also by the OCC and the FDIC.
ไม่มีอะไรที่
Will they have any
เกี่ยวเนื่องกับ
input from those who are having to pay the
การส่ง
price
ผลให้กับ
of
ทองขึ้นทองลงเลย
implementing CRA?
ยังเป็นปัจจัยเดิมอยู่ครับ
Get any input from banks that are having to navigate?
So I know that throughout the multi-year process, there's been a tremendous amount of interaction with banks, tremendous
ตอนนี้กูก็ดอยอยู่
bank lobby,
นะครับ
and also consumer groups. And then, but yeah, there's been a ton of input and working with the industry to try to achieve these statutory goals efficiently. I won't say it's perfect, but there's certainly been a lot of interaction.
So they're getting input prior to implementing the requirements for CRA or the guidelines for CRA.
น่าจะประมาณตีสามเนี่ยเที่ยงคืนครึ่งนี่แหละเล่นจบแล้วเพราะว่าส่วนใหญ่แล้วเขามักจะให้เวลาแค่ชั่วโมงครึ่งเต็มที่ครับ
Now, I think you've stated that you don't feel it's the Federal Reserve's policy to get into implementing climate change.
We're not, and we shouldn't be climate policymakers. We do have a small role.
ไม่ใช่สู้ธรรมดาสู้ชีวิตเลยเกิน
Principally with the larger banks to make sure they understand and can manage their climate.
เดี๋ยวจะมีการประมูลพันธบัตร10 ปีนะครับรู้เรื่อง
Should what be mandated?
Climate change policies be mandated by the Federal Reserve?
I think again, climate change is something that's going to affect businesses and people and regions and states and whole countries. And I think that's
ส่วนใหญ่แล้วผมจะหาข่าวตาม Twitter นะครับไม่ได้หาข่าวอย่างที่อื่นเลย
I think what we're going to affect is we just want to make sure that
ข่าวเร็วด้วยเร็วไม่ใช่เร็วนะเร็ว
risks that they're running, and these are principally longer term risks.
What's concerning to those of us in the business community who have to borrow for banks? The Federal Reserve is conducting a pilot climate scenario analysis that's being mandated, not asked. It's being mandated for the six largest banks to participate in. That seems to be like a pretty good when you have to do a scenario and mandate that they do this. Is that not the Federal Reserve getting directly involved in mandating?
I think the banks actually want this. They want these 6 big banks. They have to face this globally, and what they want is
ไม่ได้เกี่ยวกับหุ้นตัวไหนครับเกี่ยวกับทองล้วนๆครับเกี่ยวกับดอลลาร์ล้วนๆครับ
to have one set of rules.
ประมาณ
They're
ตีหนึ่ง
already running. The big 6 banks.
ประมูลพันธบัตร10 ปีเกี่ยวล้วนๆเลยครับ
Multiple climate scenarios.
Most of the banks are well capitalized now. That could change, and this is just another expense that is out there. On the CFPB, the
ประมูลพันธบัตร10 ปีครับ10 ปีครับ10 ปี10 ปี
cannot go above 12% ratio. Has that? I mean, that does not seem logical to me. Has it ever been below the 12% from your perspective?
That's someone here quoted the law, and that rang a bell for me. So that is what the law says.
ขอบิตคอยน์อยากแตะเหลือเกิน
I'd have to go back. I'm happy to provide it.
If you could, because it seems to me like that's if you've got that cap,
ผู้เล่นทีวี
businesses couldn't operate like that.
ผู้ติดตาม 1.6
Because
ห
there
มื่น
would
คน
be no
คนนี้
incentive
สุด
to
ๆครับแน่
reduce
นอน
the
และ
price as long as it's
แน่
automated.
จริง
Thank
เรื่อง
you.
พี่น้องคืออะไรของคุณคืออะไรของคุณ
Thank you for being here.
คืออะไรของคุณขอบคุณมากครับ
Gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Powell, for being with us today. The end is in sight.
1.6
I would like to begin by
1.69 ไม่ใช่
highlighting an
เหรอ
issue that has been a concern for the
อ๋อ
Congressional
ท่าน
Hispanic
ผู้หญิง
Caucus
ท่าน
and
นี้
others.
ที่
I
เขา
know
กำลัง
that
บายทองคำไว้
the
นะครับ
Chairman has
ลอง
suggested
ดูที่ว่า
that
เขาจะพูดยังไง
we're
บ้าง
going to weave in the diversity and inclusion issues throughout our hearings. So here goes my concern. There has never been a Latino Federal Reserve president. And further, only about 5% of the Federal Reserve's overall workforce identifies as Hispanic or Latino. As we know, over the past year or so, there have been several presidential vacancies at the Federal Reserve banks, and there has still been consistent failure to appoint a Latino
เห็นยัง
candidate.
เห็นยังเขาบายท
Chair
องคำแล้ว
Powell,
เห็นยั
are
ง
you aware of this trend, and do you
มี
agree
ทอง
that it's
คำเด้ง
a
แล้วนะ
problem that our diversity and inclusion numbers are in Federal Reserve Board are not reflective of the Latino population?
Yes, it's something we've been focusing on.
All right,
คุ
and
ณก็เล่นมุกไป
can
เรื่อย
we get a commitment from you that you'll work on the workforce issues internally?
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. And I'd like to now follow up a little bit on some of the questions from Representative Norman, because I too have a concern about housing costs, particularly as it relates to equity and the negative impact on minority communities. I think you said in your paper that activity in the housing sector continues to weaken, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. As he mentioned, the rates are higher, not only impacting single-family housing, but multifamily housing, and it's also becoming even more difficult for people in my district, which is 77%
ขึ้นแล้วคุณผู้หญิง
Latino, to be able to buy their first home buyer. The workforce entry-level kind of housing. As financing homes get harder, as mortgage to find and mortgage rates rise, the population of home buyers is skewing towards older, wealthier, and wider communities. In many cases, in our suburbs, equity firms are buying out the housing stock. Chair Powell, can you please speak about the relationship between Federal Reserve interest rate hikes and housing inequity, and what needs to change here?
คุณผู้หญิงเข้าบายไว้จริงๆด้วย
What needs to change
กู
is
ก็ว่าไปเรื่อย
inflation under control so that interest rates can come back down. In the meantime, they're high because inflation is hurting all of your constituents, not just the housing sector, and all of everybody's constituents. And it's our job under the law to restore price stability and also to keep maximum employment.
Is there anything else that Congress can be doing in this respect?
That would be up to Congress, but there are lots of ways in which Congress can support people in various ways. But that's really in your hands.
Right. Now, I want to move on into the numbers that you mentioned again in your remarks at page 2. You mentioned that of course, we all know there's been a record historic unemployment rate now to 3.4%, the lowest, I believe, in history. And thank you, Mr. President, for that. But you also mentioned that there's 1.9 job openings for each unemployed individual. I wondered if you could tell me how you define unemployed. What does the unemployed individual profile look like?
That has a very specific meaning. It's someone who is not working but is actively seeking a job. So, for example, if you take 6 months off and stop looking for a job, you're no longer unemployed. So that means there's a group of people who are kind of around the edges of the labor force who don't count as unemployed. And those people are marginally attached to the labor force, that kind of thing. But to be actually unemployed, you've got to be looking actively for work in the statistics.
Right. So it does not include people who are perhaps disabled and cannot find accommodations in the workplace to be able to get a job.
Unless they're looking for it. If it's the test is whether you're actively looking. I think in the last
actively looking, regardless of age,
that's right.
Whether or not they're.
It's not a value judgment. It's the way we assess unemployment. We look at the other groups too, but actual unemployment is.
How do you factor in the people that actually are on unemployment insurance?
Sorry?
how do you factor in the people who are on unemployment insurance?
Well, they're unemployed. They've got to be by definition. We count them as unemployed, or they wouldn't qualify under the state requirements.
คุณลุงจุลพาเวลไม่สามารถไม่สามารถนิยามคำว่า unemployment ได้นะครับ
That there's children, there's
เกี่ยวเนื่องอะไรกับดอลลาร์เนี่ย
people that are disabled, people that can't find daycare. There's so many other reasons why someone is unemployed. All right, thank you. Yield back.
เดี๋ยวผัดของเราก่อน
Style, the chair of the House Administration Committee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair Powell,
thank you for being here
โอ้
with
ต
us
กใจหมด
today. Your testimony
ซูม
today
สักขนาดนี้กูตกใจหมดเลย
as we look to tackle inflation, the impact that it's having on families across the United States right now. I want to go back to a comment that was quoted to you as regards to a question from Senator Kennedy yesterday regarding the impact that fiscal policy is having as it relates to inflation. And the quote that was attributed to you was that it wasn't a big factor. As we look at kind of a whole host of policies here on Capitol Hill, from reckless spending that we saw in the previous Congress, what we just discussed, individuals who are outside the labor market, how do we get these folks back into the labor market, whether or not we have policies that are discouraging folks to come back into work, as we look at high energy costs and opportunity to drive energy prices lower by unleashing American energy. How do you factor in the fiscal policies, or how should policymakers factor in the fiscal policies and their impact that's also having an inflation? Not looking for your advice on the fiscal policies, because I know you want to stay out of that. But how should lawmakers be looking at the fiscal policy and its impact on inflation?
Let's take energy, for example. So remember, inflation is the change in prices. It's not the
ขึ้นไปลูกขึ้นไปก่อนให้พ่อปิดก่อน
So energy prices have been coming down, right? They're still high, but they've been coming down. They're contributing negatively to headline inflation. So when I say it's not contributing to inflation, that's what I mean. In addition, if you look at the aggregate spending, it was peaked, and then it's been coming down. So the fiscal impulse is actually negative at this point. It's no longer. But most of the inflation that we now have, something like 2/3 of the contribution of inflation for PCE inflation, comes from the services sector, and that isn't really about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy was important at the very beginning. So was monetary policy.
แอนเทรดเดอร์บอกว่าลงด้วยนะครับเพราะมิสเตอร์สติลบอกว่าลุงพาเวลจะพูดยังไงแบบนั้นไม่หรอกยกให้ผมปิดแค่นั้นเองยกให้กูปิดก่อนยกให้กูปิดไปก่อน
The goods sector, supply chains have been getting better, and as that's happened, goods inflation has come way down, and sometimes it's negative. That's helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you. And we're so to take that one step further, we're waiting on the president's budget. It's we're anticipating receiving that in the near term. And as we look at interest payments on the debt and the cash flow implications that has, not asking for what you're going to do at the next board meeting for obvious reasons, but as you are in those deliberations to future board meetings, potential rate increases, how does the impact of interest on the debt factor into the calculus of you and
พอดีมีข่าวว่าเจ้าหน้าที่ UN และเจ้าหน้าที่ของรัสเซียนะครับจะพบกันในกรุงเจนีวาสัปดาห์หน้าเพื่อหารือเกี่ยวกับการต่ออายุข้อตกลงธัญพืชของยูเครนแล้วมันจะลบกันทำไมวะเนี่ยซื้อส่วนซื้ออย่างเงี้ยเหรอ
Why would it be something the United States doesn't need to do? Could you elaborate on that?
We're going to do our job. Congress has given us
Mr. Chill,
maximum employment price
Mr. Sale,
regulate the banks.
or Mr. Sale.
We'll do those jobs. We don't have to worry about the United States budget. That is not our job. And, it isn't that the debt today is unsustainable. It's that the path is unsustainable. So we can service our debts. It's just that we're on an unsustainable path, meaning that the debt is growing faster than the economy. So we will never look. If the central bank has to avoid taking actions because it's concerned about the budget, that's called fiscal dominance, and that's a thing you don't see among advanced economies. And it would be something we think we're a long way from.
Thanks for your feedback on that point. The CBO just released their report showing potential interest payments on the debt accelerating dramatically over the next decade, showing it would be 14% of our fiscal spend. To compare that, right, national defense would be 13, Social Security is also 14, so it's in that level. That's a policymaker issue, but your insights are helpful. I know I only have a few seconds left, and a handful of my colleagues have commented on the ongoing review of bank capital standards. I just want to echo those concerns.
ผมว่าถ้าเกิดถึงตีหนึ่งเดี๋ยวรู้เรื่องแล้วครับ
capital level.
แล้วก็อาจจะมีการจบไลฟ์ถึงตีหนึ่งอันนี้มันเที่ยงคืนเนาะเที่ยงคืนถึงตีหนึ่งเดี๋ยวจบไลฟ์เพราะว่าดูแล้วไม่น่าจะมีอะไร
out that risk and reward.
So it's always a balance. It's exactly as you say. We know that the capital increases that I supported back in
น่าจะแกว่งตัวอยู่แถวนี้ครับไม่เกิน5 เหรียญ
earlier in my time at the Fed, they made the banks stronger and they made them more resilient. And you really
ก็
want
ดูข่าวแล้วไม่เห็นมีอะไร
to stand up and keep doing its job in times of crisis. So, but the exact balance between that and the availability of capital and the cost of capital is always going to be a matter of judgment.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Williams, now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the member of Congress representing Atlanta, the city with the highest racial wealth gap in the country, I'm focused on creating an economy of inclusion, an economy that works for everyone and brings the most marginalized into our economy. Americans and Atlantans flourish when the economy works for everyone. The Federal Reserve has a mandate of maximum employment that is measured by analyzing various data points of economic conditions. In 2020, the Federal Reserve updated its approach to fulfilling and measuring this mandate to include job growth that was broad-based and inclusive. Chairman Powell, do you agree that broad-based and inclusive growth means job growth that helps reduce racial, employment, unemployment, and wage disparities?
I think it means what it says. We don't target any particular. We can't really target a particular racial or ethnic group with that, but we like to think that our decisions are informed by an understanding of diverse groups across the economy.
Well, Chairman Powell, could you share examples of how the Fed is including broad-based and inclusive job growth in the maximum employment mandate?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So one thing we do is we always, it's always part of the data that we look at each meeting. We always talk about it. We always mention it. Different unemployment rates and labor force participation rates, wage rates and things like that by racial, ethnic, gender groups, and that kind of thing. That's always in the data that we look at and talk about. That's the first thing. So it informs our pursuit of maximum employment. We're trying to take a broader, more inclusive understanding of what that statutory goal means.
Thank you. 2 weeks ago, the Federal Trade Commission released data indicating that Georgians reported the most fraud and scam claims of any other state in 2022, amounting to millions of stolen money. The Federal Reserve's website has research to protect themselves from scams where criminals leverage the Federal Reserve's name, including emails claiming potential victims are eligible for lottery winnings, robocalls threatening arrest in exchange for money, and other phishing communications. Chairman Powell, how does the Federal Reserve measure whether its counterparts are reaching the most vulnerable households and communities, especially those that might not be following the Federal Reserve press releases or your website, or have limited access to broadband?
ในบางสำนักครับ
When those kind of scams happen, particularly when they involve us, we go on social media to try to reach people and tell them that if they're contacted by someone pretending to be a Federal Reserve person, that's not. So we do that. Inspector General who works with law enforcement to make sure that law enforcement's involved. So we're aware of these scams. Yeah, I think you're talking about the ones that involve people pretending to be a Federal Reserve person and get in touch with me and I'll, we'll send you some money. And we do what we can to reach out to the public on that.
So that is that after the fact, but what happens before so that the general public is aware that this is happening? For those people who are not on social media or tracking is there another way to get this information out to the general public?
We do what we can. We're not an institution that deals with the general public very much. We deal with banks. And we, of course, our rate hikes and rate cuts, monetary policy affects all Americans. But I think when something like that happens, it's a broad program. It's a bunch of people who are perpetuating a fraud on many people, and we try to get out there quickly and try to reach people, and again, also alert law enforcement.
Thank you, Chairman. And Chairman McHenry, I go back to balance.
That is very kind and gracious of you. First of the day. We need to commend that for the record. With that, we'll recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman McHenry.
สถานะขาลง
Chairman Powell, for being with us. Chairman, is the Fed's commitment regarding ESG
ยังอยู่เพียงแค่36 กว่าเปอร์เซ็นต์
renege on their
ไม่มาก
fiduciary responsibilities?
36 กว่าเปอร์เซ็นต์ยังทรงขาขึ้นอยู่หน่อย
have policies in effect in that space. That's not an assignment that we have.
You saw some issuances by heads of some investment banks.
ๆใครอยู่ด้วยกันถึงตีหนึ่งนะครับตีหนึ่งเป็นช่วงที่อาจจะมีการประกาศตัวเลขสำคัญด้วย
Fed, you stated a couple of minutes ago that you feel that some sort of ESG. You stated that banks want it,
and no, that's different, completely different. It's regulated financial institutions that we regulate and supervise. They're subject to big ones are subject.
So the Fed,
climate change.
You agree that the Fed
all over the country.
won't ask banks to renege on their fiduciary responsibilities. That won't be.
We don't regulate the investment banks. The SEC does.
ไม่มีอะไรเลยวันนี้
So the answer is no.
What's the question again?
I'll move on.
น่าจะดอย
Earlier, some of my colleagues, Chairman McHenry, questioned the holistic review of the capital bank holdings. This holistic review, which no one has seen, according to my sources, but there are published reports that will call for more capital to be held by banks. I understand the deferral to Vice Chair Barr, but do you have any thing that you can add that would warrant a need for
10 นาทีนะครับ
banks capital increase?
ก็จะมีข่าวแล้ว
So there isn't a proposal to evaluate or talk about it yet. Vice Chair Barr has indicated he was going to take a look. He said he thinks capital is strong, and the question really is it strong enough? And I know he's been working, and there'll be a process when he does arrive at conclusions. He has no authority to enact something himself. It has to go through the Board of Governors, also the OCC.
This has nothing to do with
จะมีการเตรียมประมูลพันธบัตรอายุ 10 ปีทั้งหมดมูลค่า $3,200 ครับทวิตไปแล้วนะครับ ไม่ใช่ว่าแรงครับ แต่แอบแซงน้อยๆ เพราะเป็นพันธบัตร 10 ปีนะครับ เป็นเรื่องใหญ่ใช่ว่าเป็นเรื่องใหญ่ของเหล่าบรรดาคนที่ไปประมูล รอดูราคาพันธบัตร 10 ปีวันนี้ติดตาม Twitter นะครับ เพราะว่าในฝั่งของ YouTube ยังไม่มีอะไร
increased by over 40% in businesses, of course, just over the last 2 years. So high energy obviously affects the cost for manufacturing, wages, general cost of living, almost every aspect of society. Would not such fiscal energy policy work by the administration, working hand in hand with initiatives such as QT and initiatives of the Fed, be far more effective
ผมหาข้อมูลอยู่เด้อ
fighting inflation on your own?
So we are the agency that has the responsibility to restore price stability. We just have to do it. That's the task we've been given under the law. It's great if Congress helps. It's great if the administration helps. But we have to deliver it, and we will.
คริปโตก็มีแต่ XRP อ่ะที่มันขยับตัวขึ้นน่ะ
Fiscal policy, monetary policy
เพราะอะไรวะ
against each other.
ดีตัวขึ้นแบบโป้งๆเลยนะโป้งเดียวเลยนะ
We don't comment on fiscal
มี
policy.
ใครมีข้อมูลบ้างครับ XRP ทำไมดีตัวขึ้น เจ้าเดียวเลย
We have a job.
ทำไม
Maximum employment and price stability.
ส่วนเจ้าอื่นเหมือนกันเลย
We try to stay in our lane, stick to it.
Just the fear of a number of people that we're going to have high interest rates and higher than 2% inflation if there's not that level of fiscal and monetary cooperation.
เจ็บ
And fiscal policy does what it's going to do. We take that as exogenous. That's fiscal
มี
policy.
ข่าวคดีกับ SEC เหรอ
To do with
แสดงว่าออกมาดีเหรอ ออกมาจะชนะเนี่ยนะ
comes into the economy, and we see that we don't have a view. We don't try to comment on the decisions that we use our tools to restore price stability, no matter what happens outside of our building.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We now recognize the ranking member of the Oversight Subcommittee, Mr. Green of Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Powell, for being with us today. I greatly appreciate your work. I would like to take just a few moments to talk about how the legislative bodies have legitimized systemic racism. been done by having a Fed that has a responsibility to produce maximum employment, knowing that the
เดี๋ยวพี่นิ่งเงียบมากเลยนะ
wage gap exists.
อ๋อเหมือนจะไม่แพ้คดีเหรอ XRP
And also knowing that traditional actions and methodologies will not change that. But yet we won't give you the authority to make recommendations.
เพราะว่าเวลาที่อะไรมันเด้งขึ้นมาหรือเวลาที่ข่าวเร็วๆอ่ะผมจะคอยเซิร์ชหาพวกบรรดา Twitter ตลอดเวลาส่วน Facebook ไม่ต้องพูดถึงเนี่ยช้าผมไม่ค่อยไถข่าวจะไถนะแต่ถ้าข่าวเร็วๆจะไถพวก Twitter ซะมากกว่า
because we know
โอ้โห
we know that invidious discrimination exists in lending. We know it exists. And there are laws that will prevent and punish persons who cheat banks. You will be prosecuted and you will be fined criminally if you cheat a bank. No such law exists if you cheat a customer. We know that black people
ตอนนี้รู้สึกว่า
more qualified than white
เฟดซัดเต็มเหนียวเลี้ยวเต็มข้อรอเต็มแข้งแล้วครับถ้าไปตามทวิตผมเนี่ยผมทวิตไปเมื่อกี้คำว่าเฟดจะมีการปรับลดงบดุลที่เป็นไปได้ด้วยดีครับผมก็จะทวิตต่อว่า
racism and the bodies have become so bold now so many of the members they're so bold now as to say they're sick and tired of hearing about this
ผมก็จะทวิตต่อว่า
they don't want
น้ำตาจะไหลราคาทองคำร่วงต่อแน่นอน
they believe that
ข่าวเร็วนะ
all is well as
มีอะไรที่เร็วเหลือเกิน
but many they won't see it that way
มาดูอีก5 นาทีนะครับ
but that's the way
เดี๋ยวขอดูพันธบัตรก่อน
would lead one to conclude they have positioned themselves. Many of these people are my friends.
นี่ครับถ้าเกิด
associate with, talk to
อัตราผลตอบแทนพันธบัตรมากกว่า 3.6 แสดงว่าราคาพันธบัตรจะมีการปรับตัวร่วงลงครับทองก็จะร่วงลงด้วยเช่นเดียวกันครับ
systemic racism
โอ้โห
eliminate it can be dealt with. We know how to, but we don't have the will
จบชีวิตฉันให้เธอต้องคัดอีกแล้วจากทุกครั้งยังไม่พอ
It's the people who sit on
ต้อง
this
คัด
committee
อีกครั้ง
who won't allow laws to be passed making it a crime to deny a person a loan who is qualified to get that loan. People on this committee who will say they don't want to hear anymore and encourage persons who are professionals, experts, encourage them to push back against talk about invidious discrimination. Systemic racism.
Twitter นี้ครับ
emanates from the legislative body.
ออกเดินทางนะบ้าแล้วตอนนี้
genuinely believe that you'd like to do something about it. But you can't. It's a sad state of affairs. I thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired and yields back.
เป็นคำพูดที่แบบทรงดีครับพี่ทรงดีแล้วกัน
Chairman, thanks for being here
แต่
today.
ก็มึงก็ยังไม่จบสักทีนะนานเหลือเกิน
I just had one, and some of my colleagues had a touch on this today again.
Twitter ชื่อนี้ครับพิมพ์ไปเลยเฟลกมันเดย์ครับแต่ต้องเป็นคนที่ตาม60,000 นะ60,000 นะ
Back in the district.
สมัครไว้เลยครับ Twitter
there's a certain segment of adults, 25 to 35-year-olds, many of them dual income, no kids, and they are completely froze out of the housing market right now, either because the cost of a home in a new subdivision in any municipality is $500,000 or more. And as a result of that, it's not only by actions of the Fed, I think, on the interest rates, but certainly the other thing I wanted to bring up, because the balance sheet at the Fed has gone from $4 trillion to $9 post-pandemic, could the Fed, by no longer buying mortgage-backed securities in a smaller universe of private sector buyers who demand a higher rate of return, right? Is there another kind of built-in trigger there that mortgage rates are going to continue to go higher, unrelated to what the Fed does? Because I think the concern is that between the dynamics of no new subdivisions, 25 to 35-year-olds unable to get a loan, and then interest rates continuing to climb, all of these factors are just, we're going to lose a generation of adults here that are never going to get home ownership. They're never going to benefit, which we all know is the big wealth. If there's anything I take away from today's question, I hope that is something that the Fed is tuned to and is looking at closely.
จำเนื้อไม่ได้เดี๋ยวค่อยจำเนื้อได้ก่อนเดี๋ยวจะไปเดี๋ยวจะไปเตรียมตัวมานะครับ7 คำแค่นั้น
zoning, its people, its materials, and so the housing stock is constrained to some extent by
1 นาทีมีเสียวครับ
zoning because things are so built up.
ชีวิตแค่โดนทำร้ายที่ฉันโดนทำร้ายชีวิตก็โดนทำร้ายเพราะฉันยังไงก็คือผู้ติดดอยทำเอาซะความเชื่อเลยเดี๋ยวไปซ้อมมาแต่ละเพลงนี่กูโดนกูหมดอ่ะแต่ละเพลงโดนกูหมดอ่ะโดนทุกเพลงมาละประมูลพันธบัตรได้ยังทุกเพลงโดนหมดครับวันนี้โดนทุกเพลงเดี๋ยววันศุกร์จะเตรียมแต่ละเพลงไว้ให้ใครอยากได้เพลงไหนเดี๋ยวจัดให้ครับประมูลพันธบัตรจะไม่ออกเลยเหรอออกแล้วไหมออกแล้วยัง
There'll be buyers. I think that we'll expect that'll be the case. It might, not that it wouldn't have some upward pressure on rates for us not to be a buyer anymore, but we weren't a buyer for a very long time.
โอ้โหคุณลุงจรงพลบอกว่าเราจะเข้าซื้อตราสาร MBS เฉพาะเหตุการณ์ที่รุนแรงเท่านั้น
But thank you very much, Chair. Now you.
3.9 ครับสุดยอดการประมูลพันธบัตรอยู่ที่ 3.9 ครับทวิตไปแล้วนะครับ 3.9 ครับครั้งก่อน 3.6 ครับเนี่ยนี่ 3.6 อันนี้ 3.9 ครับสุดติ่งกระดิ่งแมวแล้วเดี๋ยวทองก็ลงต่อครับชีวิตนั้นโดนทำร้ายผมก็จะบอกว่าแฮชแท็กได้ผ่าน
And with that, the hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you ยังครับ Thank you ตอนที่กูจะคัดลอตพอดีเลยก็วันนี้ใช้คำว่าสนุกสนานอีก1 วันนะครับโอ้โหก็นะฮะประมาณนี้นั่นไงว่าละกะละเห็นยัง 3.9 ผมทวิตไปก่อนเลยนะบอกแล้วให้ตามทวิตนะครับผมไปทวิตไปก่อน43 วินะครับบอกแล้วตามทวิตผมเร็วที่สุดในโลกแล้ว ผมเห็นแล้วมัน 3.9 ไงชีวิตนั้นทนทำร้ายงั้นก็คงเป็นอีกเพลงหนึ่งที่ผมเองจะมอบให้กับทุกท่านในการที่เราจะจบไลฟ์ในวันนี้นะครับ เวลาที่ร้องเพลงนี้เราก็ต้องมีเสียงด้วยปล่อยให้ไหลไปให้ลอยลงสู่ทะเลให้มัน โอ้ยไม่ไหววะเจ็บคอจริงอุตส่าห์การเต็มที่แล้วนะเอาที่เห็นอยากเห็นคนไทยบินได้พอแล้วมึงชิบหายโอ้ยเจ็บคอแทนเลยเนี่ยไม่ไหวเอาที่สบายใจเลยนะฮะดังนั้นขอบคุณทุกท่านมากที่อยู่ด้วยกันจนวันติดดอยและทุกๆครั้งเราก็จะมีคำคมในมุมของผมเองในการจบไลฟ์ทุกครั้งนะครับวันนี้เอาสดๆเลยนะลุงเจอโรมพาเวลมึงก็ไม่เลี้ยวให้กูทำให้กูโดนเบี้ยวเลี้ยวเองไม่ได้ตายห่านวันนี้โดนกี่ทีก็ไม่เข็ดไม่ได้ว่ะแค่นั้นเองไปละดื้อๆละสวัสดีครับอายเหลือเกินกู